Welcome to this comprehensive course on OpenAI's Assistants API, which allows developers to build powerful AI assistants capable of performing a variety of tasks. This course covers essential topics like integrating the API for advanced functionalities, leveraging its knowledge retrieval and code interpretation capabilities, and understanding the fundamentals of large language models. Through hands-on projects with Streamlit and real-world examples, you'll gain practical skills to build responsive, AI-enhanced applications. By the end, you'll be able to use the Assistants API to transform your web apps into dynamic, smart platforms.
Hello and welcome to this course. My name is Paulo Dishon. I am a software engineer, so I teach people how to become software engineers, developers, and build applications. And I've also taught over 250,000 students on various skills from programming, build apps, AI, as well as cloud engineering. So welcome to this course. The next question is, what is it that you're going to be learning in this course? Well, in this course, you're going to be learning about the Assistants API. Essentially, you're going to learn about function calls, you're going to learn about retrieval mechanisms, and of course, you're going to be building a lot of stuff going through this course, because that is how I like to introduce certain concepts to my students. So that's part of what you're going to be expecting in this course. And of course, I'll be talking about large language models, embeddings, and all these things that relate to AI specifically. Okay, now let's talk about the prerequisites for this course. So I expect you to at least have the basics of programming. Of course, I don't expect you to be an expert or anything, as long as you have some fundamentals of programming, be it JavaScript or any other modern-ish programming language, you should be fine going through this course. And one thing to keep in mind is that unfortunately, this is not a one-on-one programming course. I'm not going to teach you how to program. Rather, I'll focus on the big picture idea of Assistants API and large language models. So we're going to be using Python in this course. So if you've never used Python, you don't even know what Python is, that's okay. That's not the main thing here. The main thing is that I want you to understand how this technology, how Assistants API, and how large language models, how AI-based applications are built. That is the main goal here. So don't worry, you'll be fine as long as you want to learn and you follow along what we're going to be doing. The other thing also, remember that you'll have access to all of that code in the description below. Okay, now let's go ahead and look into Python setup and essentially the environment setup so that you can follow along in this course. Now, keep in mind, if you already have Python set up on your machine and you have Visual Studio Code or any other code editor that you use, obviously you don't have to follow along because you have all that, right? So if you don't have that, then I'm going to show you right now what you need to do, what you need to install on your machine. That way you are able to follow along in this course. Now, the best place I found online where you are able to go through tutorials on how to set up Python specifically on your machine, whether it's Windows, Mac, Linux, and so forth, is this link here, which I'm going to show you right now. Let's go ahead and take a look. All right, so if you go to this link here, which is kingstar.com, knowledge base, install Python, this does everything that you will ever need, or at least has all of the instructions you need to install Python if you don't have Python installed on your machine. Okay, so just go ahead and follow exactly what they have here, and they even tell you what is Python, which is kind of nice, and all the things that you need. Okay, so just follow along. And the great thing is that you can go through these different links here. So how to install Python on Windows. If you're on Windows, click here. That will take you to this setup. And how to install Python on Mac OS, that will take you through this whole setup that you need to go through. And of course, if you're very special and are on Linux, go ahead and click here and just follow the instructions. So it's really straightforward. I don't see any value in me going through all of this with you. So go ahead and get that set up if you don't have Python set up on your machine, and we'll go from there. So the next thing we will need is an IDE, an integrated development environment. I use Visual Studio Code, which is what I'm going to be using in this course. So if you have something else that you use, that's totally fine, go with that, but go ahead and download that if you don't have it. So it's very simple. I'm going to go to Visual Studio Code, And depending on your machine, for me, I'm on Mac, it just goes straight to download Mac Universal. You can click here and you can see that we have Mac OS Universal, Windows, Linux, and all of this. Okay, so depending on your situation, just go ahead and download the version, the latest version of VS Code, and you should be ready to go. Okay, now because of the nature of what we're going to be learning in this course, which is OpenAI Assistants API, you will need to have an OpenAI account. That is very important for obvious reasons. And so particularly what you need to do is you need to go ahead and create, in this case, have an API key, because that's what will allow us to use the Assistants API and various things we can do with OpenAI APIs and so forth. So that is very important. So let me show you real quick here. So if you type in openai.com, as you see here, make this a little bit larger, you'll be able to say login. So click here. If you don't have an OpenAI account, you can go ahead and say sign up. If you already have one, you can just put your email and go ahead and sign in. Also, you can go ahead and say continue with Google, or with Microsoft account, or with Apple. So I already have an account, but in this case, you can go ahead and sign up. Okay, so I'm going to say continue with Google. I think you can also go that route to create an account, and gives you this opportunity here to choose between going to ChatGPT or going to API. We want to go to API, and this is what's going to open. So this will take us to this main view here. So there's a lot of things, a lot of capabilities, get started and all that. What we really want to go to is to go to Assistants API, which actually we're going to do that later. But what we want right now is to go to API key. So click here on API keys. You can see that I have one API key, which I created a little bit ago. So go ahead and say create an API key, and you can name this Assist API key. You can name it whatever you want, and that API key, click there to create this API key. And then what you need to do is copy this API key by clicking here and save this API key for later in this course once we get started coding and do all these things. So it's very important to not to share this with anyone. In fact, after I've created this, I'm going to delete this so that way you can't use it. Okay, so save it in a very safe place. That way you don't lose it. Okay, make sure that once you close that window, just like I said, there is no other way for you to access it to get it again. So that's why I wanted you to save it. Okay, but you can create as many secret keys as you need. So if you for some reason didn't copy that, you can go ahead and create a new one and go from there. So that should be it about setting up your API environment, understanding what we're going to be doing in this course, as well as having your API keys set up or created for us to be able to use that in this course. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at what is this thing called Assistants API. The Assistants API is a tool built by the OpenAI folks that allows developers to easily craft and build AI-based applications that leverage the OpenAI environment, the OpenAI platform per se. So the thing to understand about the Assistants API is that it's not its own entity per se, although it is, but it is attached or extends, in this case, what we know, the OpenAI API, which includes all of the tools and models that power ChatGPT and many other underlying infrastructure of the OpenAI environment. So that is the important distinction here, is that when we talk about the Assistants API, it extends what already is there, in this case, the OpenAI API. And so it makes it easier for us to build AI tools, in this case, AI assistants that we can use in our applications. So essentially gives us this platform, this framework, this libraries to quickly use these tools to build any application, AI-based application that we would want to build without having to know too much about the underlying abstraction of how things actually work. So essentially we can go ahead and create an assistant and use the API so that we can connect that assistant in our application and use that assistant that has the capability of connecting with the OpenAI APIs essentially. Now, the next thing we need to look at is for this Assistants API, what is the problem that it solves? Now, the thing to understand is that building applications in general, let alone building AI-based applications, it's a very hard task for developers because it's very complex. There are usually a lot of moving parts that a developer needs to focus on. Developers need to manage, in this case, certain infrastructures. They need to keep in mind how the data is being used, which models are needed to use, in this case, to power their applications. They have to learn how to craft the best prompts possible in order to communicate with these large language models. And they also need to understand or keep track of the application state, understand about embeddings, which is something totally different, but it is part of this realm of AI and large language models, and understand the storage mechanism, right? How do we upload files? How does the large language model use those files to allow us to tap into the main knowledge, but also those files retrieval, those files knowledge, but also retrieve information from those files, and so many things, right? So this is not easy. It's a very complex thing to carry as a developer. This poses a problem for developers because now developers, instead of focusing on building the actual application, now they're focusing on how to stitch all these pieces together to make this work. So the benefit of using the Assistants API is that all of this complexity, all of these things that developers need to know or to deal with, it's abstracted out, which means they don't have to deal with it anymore because now the Assistants API, the backend of everything, is taken care of. All we need to do as developers now is to focus on what matters, which is build our application. So the Assistants API already has all the things that we need as developers, but we don't need to think about them because it abstracts out all of that work. So one thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about large language models, is that they by themselves, they don't have a state, which means they don't save a context of a conversation per se. Now with the Assistants API, we don't have that problem because there is this thing called the persistent threading for ongoing conversation. What this means is now we're able to save messages and the context of that messages. That way, let's say if you're creating a bot, you don't have to yourself save that context so that then when you ask a certain question that the bot needs to know about the previous conversation, the bot will actually know what it's referring to because it has the context. Okay, that's huge because now we don't have to worry about that. The Assistants API has that built in. And also we have the retrieval mechanisms for digging through data. So what this means is that we can upload files for the models to use for additional knowledge base. So you can upload files about something, let's say about cryptocurrency. So now that piece of knowledge is added to the main base knowledge, right, that comes with the large language model. That way you can converse with the large language model in addition to the knowledge that we just added by uploading certain files, documents, and so forth. So now we have a more flexible and more knowledgeable, if I may say, large language model because we are aiding it with retrieval mechanisms. It also has code interpreters, so it actually writes, can analyze code, and do all sort of things, which is amazing, as you will see, okay? One of the biggest things that we now get with Assistants API is that we can actually do function calling. What that means is that when our assistant is solving a problem, we ask a question, the assistant will be able to call a function that we specify that will be used as a tool to go and fetch certain data that the large language model needs to solve a certain problem. And that is huge because now, in addition to uploading files for retrieval mechanisms and so forth, we can also add more tools by adding these functions that go serve as agents that can go and do something else and bring back the results, which are going to be used by the large language model, in this case the OpenAI API per se, or the assistant, right, to solve the problem or to answer accurately what you are asking it for. That's pretty awesome, mind-blowing. Let me show you the diagram here real quick so you can see visually the Assistants API benefits. So if you look at this diagram here, right, the assistants can go ahead and call the OpenAI models, right, to tune their personality, in this case, their capabilities. Also, these assistants can also access multiple tools in parallel. So now it's sort of having these agents that can go and do stuff and bring back the results so that we can help the assistant to be a better assistant, right? So in this case here, these are tools. The tools that we have here, we talked about the code interpreter. We have the knowledge retrieval, right? Files and documents we can upload so that our assistant is more knowledgeable about certain topic. As well, function calling. Now, the great thing about a functional calling is that we can it's a way for us to create our own tools on top of the tools that the assistant already has access to, such as the code interpreter, knowledge retrieval, and so forth. So now with this, we can create our own tools, right? Our own functions that go, for instance, and fetch the current situation in Bulgaria, or go and fetch some sort of data in a database somewhere. You get the idea. And along with everything that I said, we have these persistent threads. The threads we'll talk about in a second here allows us to have these messages that we are saving or are being saved in our conversation. And so those are saved for context, which is huge because remember, all large language models, they don't have a concept of saving history per se. So they're stateless. So they don't have a way of saving the context, which is problematic when we want to refer to a certain concept that was talked about. If they're not saving that history, then it wouldn't know what you're referring to. So context is very important, and that is all given with the Assistants API. Okay, and of course we can access files in several formats. So this is a diagram I wanted to show you about the benefits of the Assistants API. Now, most like, of course, you've heard of the chat completion API, which is the one that you've been using if you're using the OpenAI API, right? So you just send messages and you receive a response. And it's very useful because the completion API, it goes straight to the OpenAI models and asks questions, and the large language models, and of course the knowledge base. But the thing here is that this knowledge base is a knowledge base that is already there. There's no addition, meaning if you were to ask certain questions about something that was done or happened after September 2023, I believe, right? Anything that was done after that, then this large language model here wouldn't have that knowledge base. So it would just say, I don't know. Because the completion API is just a way for us to get direct response. Okay, that is the difference here between the chat completion API, which is useful, with the Assistants API, as I have discussed earlier. Okay, so let's look at this general comparison so we can see the differences between the Assistants API and the Chat Completions API. Okay, this is just to have some sort of an overall idea. So you can see here the aspect column and the Assistants API, the Chat Completion API. So for Assistants API, initial setup, you have to create an assistant with defined capabilities, which we'll see in a little bit. For chat completion, of course, there's nothing for you to set up. You just call the API and get the results, the answers, and so forth. For the Assistants API, we have to initiate and manage, in this case, a thread for ongoing conversation. We'll talk about what a thread is and all that stuff in a little bit. And for the chat completion, of course, we have none of that. So this is just to show you the differences between the Assistants API and the Chat Completions API. And you can go down here to complexity, so more complex setup, of course, for the Assistants API, and it's simpler, of course, for the Chat Completions API. Okay, so no need to memorize this. This is just something you can take a screenshot of and then go ahead and just take a look to see the differences between the Assistants API and the Chat Completions API. Okay, and there you have it. All right, so we just finished looking at the benefits of the Assistants API and how it works and how it facilitates our lives as developers so that we can focus on actually building those AI-based tools, right? Instead of worrying about the underlying infrastructure things that we would have to do if we didn't have assistants. So now let's look at the Assistants API, the building blocks, because we talked a lot about the underlying infrastructure, how it works, the benefits. Let's go ahead and look inside and see what are the building blocks of an assistant, right? So here is a diagram. I like having diagrams because it hopefully helps you conceptualize these ideas. The Assistants API has about 4 main building blocks. So first, you see that we can have, in this case, an assistant. So the assistant itself is, in this case, the entity, the thing, per se that we actually build, which we'll then use to help us get information about certain topic. And so in this case here, we can have an example, an assistant who is a travel agent bot that we can use. So that is the first component. And the second component, or second building block, is what we call threads. A thread is where all of the messages that occur between the assistant and the user, because that is the whole idea, all those messages are tracked here in the thread. So in this case here, a users may have a message that say, hey, what is the cost for an extra day in Paris? Okay, so that is a message that is going to be on a thread, which the assistant will have access to, as well as the user. And then the assistant's message would be the cost is 12,890, for instance, right? But then you will ask, okay, there is the assistant's message, but how does the assistant know? Well, the whole process has to go through the other piece here, the other building block, which is the run entity. So the running entity needs to have a few things for it to be able to run those queries, those questions, essentially evaluate what's going on. So there is this dialogue per se that's happening. So in this case here, the run, as you can see here, has to have access to the assistant. In this case, you will see later, it's just going to be an ID. And also has to have access, or has to have a reference to the thread, because that's where all the messages are. So in this case here, the assistant is going to be our travel agent bot, and the thread is trip to Paris, for instance. And then inside of this run, the run can be triggered to then run different steps to get to that conclusion, or to get to the result. What would happen is, if you look at all of this, we have in this case the assistant, the number one building block. We have thread, that is the number two building block. Inside of the thread, that's where we have the message. So messages, or message, that's the number three building block. And number four is the actual run entity. Okay? And so how would all of this work? Well, we have the assistants, and inside of the assistant we have the thread. We have a message from the user. What is the cost for an extra day in Paris? That is going to be sent to run, which will have the assistant ID as well as the thread ID, because it needs to know where to pull those messages that are coming in from, right? And then it's going to go through a process. Steps. Number one, use code interpreter if that's what needed to calculate things. And then it's going to go ahead and create a message. And if need be, this is the beauty, it's going to be able to go and call any other tool that may be needed in order to get the correct response. And the response is going to be as a message, which is going to be returned back again to our thread. Does it make sense? So the thread is where all the action really is being dumped into, the history per se, right? And there we go. And now the thread will have the assistant's message, because all the steps are done. We have the response, and it goes back as a message, assistant's message, which then we can use that to show in our application. These are the Assistants API building blocks. Now, it's very important here because it can be a little bit tricky at first to really conceptualize the idea. The assistant itself needs a thread. A thread, that's where all the messages go. Just think of a bucket of messages, right? And then the entity run here, this is where the running of things, to go and fetch things, to go through these steps, this is where it happened. The run needs to have reference to the assistant, because it needs to know who is this assistant. Because remember, the assistant will have all of the specifications that it needs, so it knows what it specializes in. In this case, is a travel agent bot. So the run needs to have a piece, in this case, a reference to these assistants. So when it goes and starts running the steps, it knows what knowledge base it needs, as well as other tools to indeed create those messages back. So the assistant's messages are all here, so that we can then use those messages to show in our applications and so forth. All right, so very simple, but it can be complex to wrap your head around. Understand and conceptualize these building blocks, then what's coming next is not going to be too complicated. Okay, so rewatch this part if you need to, but I think you should be good. So what we'll do next is we're going to go in the dashboard, in the playground, and look at creating an assistant manually. And later, of course, we're going to do that using code. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. So now let's go and log into the OpenAI dashboard. So you should have an account and everything now. When you log in, this is more or less what you're going to be seeing. So what we want to do is we want to hover over here if you don't see that. So if you click here, this is what you're going to be seeing. I'm going to hover over and we're going to go to assistants, but this is where we need to go. So click here. And sometimes it takes some time. It looks like incorrect. Let's go ahead and refresh this. Okay, there we go. So today we've been having some issues, but just refresh if you're having some issues. Okay, so once you're here, let's go ahead and create our first assistant. So you can go ahead and say create here or from here, doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and create. And the first thing we need to do is to add a name. So let's say this is going to be personal trainer as such. And then we need to pass or add the instructions. So because it's an assistant, we need to say, okay, you are X, Y, and Z, you're knowledgeable in this area and so forth. Okay. I have the instructions here. So I'm just going to paste it in here and I'm going to click here to make it a little bit larger. So this says you are the best personal trainer and nutritionist who knows how to get clients to build lean muscles. You've trained high caliber athletes and movie stars, because that is exactly what we are all are striving to be. Okay, so there we go. So these are the instructions. Of course, you will want to put as many instructions as a prompt, really, as you need for your assistants. So if specify exactly what you want your assistants to help you with. Okay, I'm going to go back. And next, we're going to choose the model, right? The OpenAI model that we're going to be using. There are a few, and as of recording of this video, we have the GPT-4 preview. And of course, these numbers will change depending on when you're going to be watching this video. Okay. But just remember that the concepts of how this works, that's what really matters instead of things that may change here. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the GPT 3.5 Turbo. That should be fine for now. And it's a little bit cheaper as well. So you are more than welcome to go to the higher. So I'm going to just use that one. Really, that's fine. And then we have the tools. We talked about the tools. So these allow us to attach certain things that we want this assistant to be able to do if it doesn't already have those tools, right? So we have here retrieval, we have the code interpreter, and we can add functions as well. Okay, so we don't need anything. I'm just going to go ahead and toggle the code interpreter just because why not? Okay, and anything else we can just leave as is. And I'm going to say save as such. So now the assistant was created. And if I get rid of this and get rid of that, and we can see that we do have our personal trainer. So there is the instructions and the ID. So this is very important because remember the diagram I was showing you earlier was that when things start running, when we have that fourth component or building block, which is the run, it needs to know this personal trainer, or in this case, the assistant. So this is an ID that will be used internally. Later, we're going to be able to generate or create assistants using code, which I'm going to show you, but I just want to give you an overview right now. So very important, these IDs are going to be used. And from here, you can see we can go and say test. So if you click here, this will open a different tab as you see here, and then you can test it out to see if this actually works. For instance, you can enter a message. Remember, this is the message. In this case, will be the user message. If I show you exactly this Assistants API building blocks, this is what we've set up. So we have the assistant, which in this case, we said is travel agent bot, but in this case is our trainer, personal trainer. And we have thread, which we haven't created yet. It hasn't been created, but we will create. All of this is going to be created in the back end once we start running things. And then we have the messages, which is now the user's message is exactly what we pass here. Okay. So say, I want to build muscles. What foods should I eat? I'm going to go ahead and say run. Haha. Run. What do you think it's supposed to do? Well, what's going to happen now when we run, first of all, that message, the moment we say run, the message will be added to thread. Aha. And you can see it even says a thread here, right? So the thread right now is empty. If I say run, it's going to go ahead and add that message. and the instructions is showing here. And there's a lot of things that's happening here. So let me go ahead and go through everything. I'm going to just make this, probably can't make that smaller. That's okay. And one thing you can see here, this is the thread, and each thread that is created, because it is indeed a simple message, right? And each thread that is created has also an ID. This will make sense later. So you can see here, we have all information. So the thread is where all the messages are going to be from, in this case, our user, the question that we ask, as well as when we run and come back, we should have the personal trainer, the message as well. Just like what I showed you here. This run went ahead and pulled in the assistant ID internally, and then the thread ID internally, and then went through the steps and spit out the assistance message, which now we can see here is the message, right? This is the assistant, says personal trainer. That's the name of our assistant, and says to build muscles, lean muscles. That is, it's important to focus on balanced diet. That includes blah, 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 protein-rich foods, whole grains, fruits and vegetables, healthy fats, dairy products, and all this great stuff. And even gives us a little recommendation here. And note, it's important to consult with a healthcare professional and all that great stuff. Very cool. This is what's happening, right? So essentially it goes back to what I showed you earlier. Going back here, you can also see that we have logs. Now this is really cool because it allows us to look at exactly what happens. So you can see here, we can hide the logs. We don't want to hide the logs right now because I want to show you something. So for our logs here, look at what happened. The moment we said run, what happens is that a thread was created. Indeed, because we need a thread where all the messages are going to be in. Just like again, what I showed you here. Okay, this is good. Okay, so if we open here, you can see exactly what happens. So the thread was created and we have a response, which is indeed the thread ID. And this ID here is exactly the same as this, because this is the thread ID that was created. Okay. And we have some other metadata. That's okay. And then we added a message to that thread. The message was the one that we wrote here. In fact, you can see all that happens here on the thread visually, it is what's being shown here as a log. But I want you to understand this so you know where things are in case when things don't work, you understand where to find things, okay? So we have our add message here. The message was added. The role is user, because I am a user in this case, because I entered the message here, right? So going back, it is this message here, which is going to be sent to run. Very good. So that happened. Let me go ahead and close this. We added a message and then we run the thread, right? It just did a post request. It has to have the assistant ID. What did I tell you? Because if you look at this diagram here, first you said assistant, the name, but internally it has to have the actual ID as well as the thread ID, which is exactly what's happening in the backend. If I close this thread here, let's see. You can see that has the response, and the response, each response has, of course, an ID, and the object is run, and when it was created, the assistant ID, as well as the thread ID, voila, and all of this other metadata, as well as the model that was used, the instructions, all of that was sent along in the response, okay, in the thread. And then, of course, get run's status, because when we hit run, what happens in the backend, things are happening, meaning these steps are going to go to you see, maybe it has to use a code interpreter, create a message, and do all these other things. It's not until all these steps are done, which means an answer, a message, in this case, an answer from our run, okay, our assistant in this case, it's not until then, once that is done, that the message is actually created and sent back. So all of that is happening here. Right, this is the log and run step. Let's see what happens first. It has this object here. This data, if I open this data here and keep opening, it has the ID, the object, right? These are the steps, right? In fact, that's exactly what I'm showing you. There's the status, and this is the steps going through the whole process of creating, crafting this message for the assistant message, which is going to be sent, and then we can see the results. right? Let's continue. So you can see it has a JSON here response. It comes in as a list, an object list, and we have the data field, which has an ID, the object, the thread step, a run step, where it was created, and all the great stuff. And continue the other step, and as many steps as possible, and then the status, run status, to tell us whether the running is over. Everything is set up now. We have the response, a message which can be passed back to the assistant, right? So that we can then see. Let's see, continue, completed. You can see here that the status now is completed, which means all is good. We should have a formulated message. Okay, if I go to tools, you can see what tools were used. Code interpreter, right? In this case, even though it wasn't really needed, but it's okay. And then get runs. You can see now it returns data, which has an ID, has an object, and the status and everything. And then we go to the message response. Now comes in as object list and the data there. And you can see now we have the ID, the thread message. Okay, the first one there. And then this is for the assistant. If you open here, you will see that assistant should have, let me click here to open. There we go. And there we go. We have the actual value, which is exactly this, what you see here. It says to build muscles, or lean muscles, all of that information which we received back. So the assistant in this case went through this whole process that I showed you earlier, and return the assistant message, in this case back to our thread, which then we can see, in this case we're able to see that the information, the message is here. So this is a very good representation of the assistants and all the building blocks. But this is really cool, the logs, because we can actually see the whole process of what's happening, so we understand exactly what's happening. So it's not this mystery box per se. What we've learned here is that to create an assistant here manually, you have to easily just go to the Assistants API, or playground that is, and just hit create, and you have to pass the name of your assistants as well as the instructions, right? So specify what you want your assistants to be good at, or to what knowledge these assistants has to have, right? What they're going to help you with. And then of course that will generate the ID as you see here. And of course, as you create the assistants, you have to, of course, as I showed you, you have to make sure that you attach the right model and the tools that you want to attach to. So what I want you to do is to create, for instance, a code assistant. Okay, so essentially come up with instructions for an assistant that can help you with code issues, right? You can say you are a very helpful Java developer assistant, blah, blah, blah. You're knowledgeable about the basic of Java, intermediate and advanced. And so you help developers to do pair programming, whatever it is, and test it out and see if it works. And make sure, because it's code based, make sure, of course, in this case, you really would need to have this code interpreter, because then you can paste in as a message, user message, a piece of code and ask the assistant if this code will compile, if there's something you can do, they can do to improve it, and so forth. So you have some ideas on how this works. Okay, do that and save changes and create the assistant, and then test it out and see if it works. All right, go ahead and do that, and I'll see you next. All right, so now we're going to actually do the same thing we did before, but in code, which is very exciting. The first thing we need to do is let's go back to our playground here, Assistants Playground, log in and everything. And I hope you were able to do that little exercise earlier. If not, well, what can I say? All right, so what we'll do here is we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to be using code, right? So I'm going to go ahead and delete this. Yes, I know it's very sad, but you got to go. Okay, now it's empty. So we're going to do all that using code. So you should have Visual Studio Code installed, or any other IDE that you may use. That's fine. And you should also have Python, everything set up. So everything should be good, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new folder for our project. So personal trainer as such. I'm going to cd to our personal, should be personal, but persona, that's fine too. Okay, so it's empty there. So I'm going to say code to open this exec here. Just going to close that one. And then there we go. So we don't have much going on here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file. Let's call this main.py. There we go. And also I'm going to go ahead and create, in this case, requirements.txt, requirements.txt. Such. This is where we're going to put all of our dependencies and libraries that we need for our Python and for our project, I should say. And next, what I'm going to do, let's go ahead and create a file. This is going to be our environment variable file, so .env. This is where we're going to put our environment variable. So the idea is we're going to have our OpenAI environment variable. Let me close this down like that, and we're going to put your OpenAI key. Remember that key that I showed you earlier? So essentially, you're going to come here and go to API keys, and if you don't have an API key, go ahead and create one, just like I showed earlier, and take that key, and that's what you're going to put inside this here. Okay, so go ahead and do that. And for requirements here, I'm actually going to pass in a few ones. I'm going to say python.env, and I also need OpenAI package like that. Very good. So that's inside of our requirements.txt. I'm going to create another file here called .gitignore. So that's for me to hide a few things once I push this to the repository, GitHub repository, so that you don't have things that you don't need. Okay. So in this case here, I'm going to make sure that our Git, it's going to bypass the environment variable file so that it's not pushed. I'm going to create a Python environment. That way we can run pip install to install everything in this environment specific for this project. To do so, remember I'm on Mac here in Python 3, and then it's going to be, I'm going to say -m-venv as such, and then the name of the environment. So I'm going to just say my env. Like that. And what will happen now is just going to go ahead and create. I'm going to say yes because you notice a new environment has been created. Say yes. I'm going to use that, and you will see now we have this my env with binaries include libraries and everything. This is our Python environment that we can use then to activate it. So to activate it, I'm going to say source my env, and then I'm going to go to binary and then activate. Hit enter. You can see now my env is environment is activated. So that's really good, which means then I can say pip install -r and pass the requirements.txt, which has all of these dependencies or packages or libraries that we need. So I'm going to hit enter. So it's going to go ahead and get all that information for us. Okay, so all the packages have been downloaded. That's really good. I'm going to just clear all out of this. And then now, if you look at my env, of course, you're going to go to binaries. You can see that we have .env, we have OpenAI, which is exactly what we added. Very good. So we should have everything set up now. I'm going to get rid of this. So let's go ahead and do some importing here. So I'm going to import OpenAI library, and I'm going to set up the .env so that we are able to get the environment variables and do all the great stuff. So I have all that information here. I'm just going to copy that and paste in here. Okay, import and find .env and load an env from .env package. All right, and I'm going to call this load env there, so that it all set up. And then I'm going to create a client here, which we're going to be using. The client's going to be OpenAI as such. Okay, and now with this client, we're going to be able to call the OpenAI API assistant and anything else that we want because we have created that. Now you could have also done something like this, OpenAI, right? And then say .api key, and then go to os.environment.get and pass the OpenAI key, which is the key in this case, the value that we put inside of our environment variable. Okay, so that's another way to do that. But since I'm loading all the environment variable, this seems to work. Just a client OpenAI, and also if you want, you can pass the OpenAI key directly from here. But it seems to work just like this because it gets all the environment variable. If not, just go ahead and add the OpenAI key directly here, or just like what I showed you. Let me just do that again. I'm going to put it here. I'm going to leave it there, all like that. Okay, whatever works for you, go ahead and do that. Or the other way too, I'm going to put it all here. There's another way you could have done. You said client, OpenAI, and just like I said, pass the API key and go ahead and do the custom environment variable if you change the names, okay? But if you are using OpenAI underscore API underscore key, then this should just work as it is. All right, I'm going to leave that there just in case you need that. All right, very good. So next, what I'm going to do, let's go ahead and say model. This is just a variable that we're going to be using. And the model we're going to be using, it's going to be GPT-3 for Turbo. And I'm going to put it here for now, okay? Now, we may change this. You may want to use GPT-4 preview depending on situations, but so far, so good. Okay, so now that we have everything set up, let's see how can we create, in this case, an assistant. Right? In this case, we're going to create the trainer, the personal trainer assistants. Very simple. All we do, I'm going to just put here, all we do really is just say the assistants. I'm going to say personal. And then I'm going to use our client, right, which has instantiated our OpenAI there. I'm going to say client, and I'm going to go to beta. Remember that because as of recording of this video, the Assistants API, it's actually in beta, which means they're still working on it. And so maybe by the time you watch this video, you watch this course, maybe you won't need to say beta, which will be great. So just keep that in mind. For now, we just have to go to beta. And then we go to assistants. And once we get to assistants, we go ahead and say create, very conveniently, and then we can pass certain parameters here. Okay, so what parameters do we pass here? Well, first of all, we need to pass the name that we want to name our personal assistant. In this case, I'm going to call this personal trainer as such. And then we pass instructions, which are very, very important, as you remember. And I'm going to pass the instructions here real quick. So these are the same instructions that we used before. So you are the best personal trainer, nutritionist, and you've trained high caliber athletes and movie stars. Okay, there we go. We have all of that information. Let me get rid of that. Don't know where that came from. There we go. All right. And the next thing we need to pass here is the actual model, because we need to remember this is the same thing we've done manually. So now we are passing the model that we're going to be using, or the assistant it's going to be relying on. And it's going to be the model that we pass here. Just put in this variable so it's easier to change in one place. So just like that, we created our assistant. And I can go ahead and say print. In this case, I'm going to say personal trainer dot ID, right? This will give us the actual ID of this personal trainer assistant that we just created, okay? And I'm going to go and comment that out for now. And the next thing we need to do is to create, yes, the thread, because this is where all of the messages, as you know, will be. So to create a thread, again, you'll see that's very easy. I'm going to say thread and use client again, beta. And I'm going to go ahead and say threads and dot create. Again, for our thread, we need to pass a few things. Now, the cool thing here is that for our thread, we pass the messages, which is going to be a list. So these messages here, I'm going to pass an object. In this case, I'm going to start with the role, okay? And the role is going to be user. And for the user, in this case, the content is going to be what? Well, I'm going to just put something. I'm going to say, how do I get started working out to lose fat and build muscles? Something like this. So this will be the first message. It's going to be sent for as the user, okay? We could have created a thread with no messages at all and then add those messages later, but we can go ahead and add a message, a user message right away as well. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and print. Actually, let's call this thread ID and get that thread ID. So just thread.id, okay, because those are needed. And I can go ahead and print thread ID as such, so we see. And I can do the same thing here. Assistant ID and personal.id like that. And then here I can just go ahead and when we need it, I'm just gonna go like that. Very good. So now that we have these two things, what will happen now if you run this, Well, we are going to be able to create an assistant, right? And also, in this case, create a thread and get those IDs, which you will see in a second here. So let's go ahead and run this real quick and see if this works. All right, so I know my environment is active, so I'm going to say Python 3. So make sure on Windows, I think it's just Python. And I'm going to say main.py. And let's go ahead and make sure everything is good, I think. Let's go run. Voila. And you can see that we have our assistant ID because we want to create that assistant ID. We created here, personal trainer, and we're printing it out. And we also have the thread. Let's see if this is correct, because as you saw, we deleted everything in our backend, in our playground. And now if we go back, let's see, let's go to our assistants. We should see our personal trainer assistant, which was created just now. All right. And this ID is 7YT5. You can see 7YT5. That is exactly what we have here. You can see we have that personal trainer name, instructions, and the model that we're using. That's what we specified and so forth. And internally, we do have a thread, which is this thread here that is ready to be used, which will have a message. So now this is not working. We're not seeing anything right now, but it's okay because we're going to be using that. Okay, so we have our assistant and we have a thread where all the messages are going to be in. And so going back to code here, we understand that if we were to run this again, that would kind of defeat the purpose because we have our assistant created already. It would go ahead and create yet another assistant, which is not what we want. And this is the reason why in this case here, we were able to get those. In this case here, you can see we have the assistant ID as well, the thread ID, which we're going to be using to proceed creating and conversing, in this case, with our assistant. So what I'm going to do here, I'm copy these two real quick, and I'm going to just go ahead and hard code our IDs so that we can use them. Okay, so I'm going to do it like that. So this is going to be assist. Put that into variables that we can actually use. Okay, let's not give spaces so we don't run into issues. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and comment all of this out here. Okay, I'm going to leave this as is, so we don't need to, you will have access to all this code anyway. So now we have what we need. So in this case, the assistant ID, when we use that, it's going to be created, right? In this case, we're going to be reference that. In fact, I'm going to move all of this to the bottom here because we already have all of that. So I'm going to also comment this out because we don't need that anymore. So now we have the information that we need, which is the thread ID and the assistant ID because they have been created as you saw in the backend. Okay, so what we'll do next is we're gonna go ahead and create the actual message, another message here, so we can start conversing with our API, Assistants API. Say create a message. So I'm going to say message. I'm going to set that to, let's say what are the best exercises for lean muscles and getting strong. That's our message. We're going to then add to the thread. To add to the thread, well, I'm just going to say message again, and I'm going to say client that beta and threads, and I'm going to go to messages, right, and then create, in this case, a message. And for the message, well, in this case here, the thread we need to pass the thread ID, which is going to be the thread ID, and we need to pass the role, which is going to be the user role, right, because we are conversing, we are asking a question to them. And then the content, in this case, is going to be the message, which we created at the top here. And next, we are going to then run the thread, or in this case, run the assistant. How do we do that? Well, we need to create that entity first to run our assistant. And to do so, I'm going to say run, and then I'm going to use client again, beta, threads that runs, right? That creates. So we need to create that runs entity, which is attached to the thread. And you can see the beauty here, because we said earlier that run needs to know the assistant ID, that's why we kept it, as well as the thread ID, so that they can get message and added that back to that thread. So in this case, I'm going to pass the thread ID. It's going to be thread ID, and the assistant ID is going to be the assistant ID. And in this case, instructions, we need to pass the instructions for our run. Okay. So in this case, I'm just going to say, please address the user as James Bond. And there we go. So now we have our run here. Now we have to remember that our run has to go through different steps. You could go and find a tool that needs to be able to assist the user well, right? To give the assistant more power, things that it needs to do, right? Go through all the steps that we saw before. You may need to then formulate, of course, that message back, right? It's going to be the assistant message with the result that the user would want to receive. Okay, so that takes time because it's a process. So what we'll do here is I'm going to put together a helper function that will help us deal with the waiting, the stepping that the run has to do before it gets to the result, right? The message is written back, the response, etc. Okay, so for the sake of time here, I do have this wait for run completion. So essentially we're passing the client and passing the thread ID, run ID, and then sleep interval is going to be 5. Now for this to work, I'm going to have to import a few other things here real quick. So because it's going to calculate, in this case, the time, the starting time, and all of that to give that elapsed time. So I'm going to just go ahead and paste in the time, logging, and daytime from daytime. Okay, so these are the packages that we need. So essentially what this is doing here is we're going to wait. So while true, we're going to try. We're going to go ahead and say client threads retrieve. In this case, we're going to pass the thread ID and the run ID. And then it's going to check if run completed at, and it's going to go through and get the elapsed time. We're going to get that, and we're going to subtract. So do all the calculation just to tell us how long this whole process took. It's not necessary, but it's fun to know. And then we're going to print run completed at the formatted elapsed time. And we're going to log that, okay? But most importantly, this is where we're actually going to get the messages, that is, once the run is completed, because that's where also the message that we need, the assistant is going to be spitting out, sent to us. That's where it's going to be, because all of that is going to be put back into the thread. Okay, so what we do here is we go through our threads again. Remember, threads, that's where all the messages are, the user's messages as well as the assistant messages live. We're going to go through that because it's a list, and then we need to pass the thread ID so we can get those messages. That's very important because you could have multiple threads going, right? But on the same assistant. So it's important to understand that we need to pass the actual thread ID so that we know we're looking at the right bucket, in this case, where all the messages are, so we can retrieve all those messages. And then we're going to get the last message, okay, that is there, because that's going to be our response in this case. And then we're going to go to the text and get the value. Okay, this is how we get the response. So the response here is going to go to last, which is the messages, go to content, and then the text and the value. And we're going to retrieve that. And now here, this is where I'm going to actually run by just calling the wait for completion and pass what needs to be passed, which is the client. I'm going to call client. Okay. I could have just, because the names are the same, I could just pass client, but let's just say client like this. And then I'm going to pass the thread ID. It's going to be thread ID. I need to pass what else? It says thread ID, run ID. So run ID. In this case, how do we get the run ID? Well, we know that we have our run here, which is being passed along, right? So we're going to pass that run.id. So I'm going to say run.id. So we get that for this to work. And there we have it. So when we run this, we should see some sort of result. Let's see if this works. I'm going to go ahead and open here. And let's say Python 3 main.py. In your case, if you're Windows, it's going to be something else. Let's run. If all goes well, it will take a little bit because it's thinking. And we should see, once all is done, we should see some results. All right, there we go. Now we have a result. So if you go up here we can see the run completed in what would be 24 seconds, right? And then the assistant response, well, James Bond, because we told it to refer us as James Bond. When it comes to getting lean and all that stuff, it's essential to focus on a combination of resistance training and cardiovascular exercises. There's squats, deadlifts, bench press, pull-ups, chin-ups, lunges, planks, and all of that great stuff. So we got the response. So you can see that this indeed works, right? And the other thing you can do also here is we noticed earlier that whenever we run something, let's go to test here, you can see that we have logs. So we can actually go and look at all the logs if we want to in code. To do so, I'm going to, in fact, it's going to be the steps, right, of whatever it's happening, all the steps. When we say run, the steps it goes through. So I can do that as well real quick here. To do so, I'm going to say run steps, put in a variable, and I'm going to use client, beta again, threads, and runs and steps. Look at that. And then in this case, it's going to come in as a list. So I'm going to say that list, and I'm going to pass, again, you guessed it, the thread ID, because it needs to know where I'm getting the steps from, or for in this case, and the run ID, which is going to be run.id. Okay. And remember this run here, it is what we created earlier here. Very important. All right. So what I can do now is I'm going to change the message here that the user, and I can say, how much water should I drink in a day to get healthier? Okay. There we go. So let's go back and open our terminal. And I'm going to run this again. Okay, so there we go. We have a result here. Took about 15 seconds. And to maintain a good health, James Bond, it's generally recommended to aim for intake of 8 glasses, roughly 2 liters of water per day. However, this is general guideline, blah, 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 and all that information. It's very good. Look at this. Stay hydrated, 007. Prioritize your health and well-being. Very cool. Very cool indeed. So this is very exciting. Notice here that now we have this power of creating different assistance APIs, right? And create threads, and different threads actually even within that one assistant API. And we can have all this conversation and get response. So you can see how easy this is. And this is a very simple example. And later I'm going to show you how to create an actual bot, or how to create a bot, a chat bot, where you can go ahead and start chatting, and then the assistant will respond, and you can get information that way as well, which is really interesting. And now you can see the advantages here, right? The advantage is that not only are we just going to come here in the playground and create assistants and having to interact with it here. We can, obviously, but that's not scalable, right? Because we want to build application that will leverage this assistance API. And this, what we're doing here, is indeed what it's the leverage that we're given by the Assistants API, because now we can use the API, the actual Assistant API, to create in code and attach this to a website or any application that we may be building ourselves. And then we can also go steps and look at all the steps, right? In fact, I did not. There we go. So I didn't I didn't print the steps. Let's go ahead and print the steps. Oh, you probably saw that. And I'm going to put inside of F string here, I'm going to say steps, and say run steps, and that data. That's how you get to the steps, data, and then it's a list. Okay, and voila. Okay, let's go ahead and run this again. Of course, it didn't do what I wanted to do because I didn't print it out, but that's okay. Let's give a new message. How many reps do I need to do to build lean muscles? Okay, let's see if this works, and run again. All right, And you can see, we know, of course, this works, but what I want to show you is that we can see these steps. Look at this object here, cat ID, step ID, the assistant ID, and all this information. But most importantly, it also has all the things that happened. So step details, this message creation details. Let's just print that as an object itself, just the data. Let's see if we're going to get more. Okay, so you can see we have thread, the run steps, and all other these metadata and when it was completed, the assistant IDs, and all this other information here that was generated, type message creation, and voila. Now, I really hope that you're seeing the whole value, the whole leverage that we get with this. Okay, so go ahead and play around with this concept, of course. As always, thank you so much, and I'll see you next. Okay, so we're making real good progress here. So now what we'll do is we're going to create yet another very awesome application here called the Current News Summarizer Assistant. So essentially it's going to be a summarizer, a new summarizer that will allow us to learn a few new things. What we're going to be using in this case is going to be the function calling tool. Now, if we go back to what we saw before when we talked about the Assistants API in the beginning, we noticed that we have the Assistants API, which taps into API models. And then in this case, it calls with specific instructions to the OpenAI model, and also can access multiple tools in parallel, which is amazing because in this tool list, we can have different things, different tools, right? So we can have code interpreter, we can have knowledge retrieval, which we'll see later. But the cool thing also, but the amazing thing is that we also have access to function calling, which is great because it sort of gives us wings per se, which allows us to create our own tools, right? Meaning we can create functions that will be able to fetch data somewhere or do something and then retrieve that information and push it back to the large language model, in this case, the OpenAI models, and the assistants can then do what it needs to do. So this is the part that we are going to be look into in these upcoming lessons. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to be building this summarizer application, at least a little demo so you understand what's going on. All right, so this is the app. It's called News Summarizer. So essentially, this will allow you to enter any topic. I could say, for instance, vaccine, and then I can run the assistant. So what will happen here in the back end, it's going to go and tap into a function, a function calling, a function that was created, which is going to be called by assistant. And that function is actually going to get an API, a news API, pull the news that have this topic, vaccine, and then summarize everything for us. And as you can see, we have here are some news articles on the topic of vaccines. And then we have this other headline here. And the great thing is that we also can click here to go to see more of those news about whatever is that is being talked about. So it's very cool. And so it gives you some sort of a summary. And at the end, of course, I added these run steps, which just logs out the run steps from the assistant, as we've seen before. Okay, it's very cool. So this is exactly what we're going to be building. I can also enter another topic here. Let's say Bitcoin. Why not? And it's going to go ahead and run. This is actually a Streamlit application, which I'll show you how to put together. It's very simple if you've never heard of or never even done anything with Streamlit. It's very cool. Okay, so it's running, as you can see here, and it takes a bit, of course, because it's pulling all that information, calling that function, and then retrieving that information, and then pull it back to the AI. Okay, so there we go. We have here are some articles on the topic Bitcoin. It tells us exactly what's going on, gives some descriptions. So this is what we're going to be building, and let's go ahead and get started. So we need to go ahead and get an API key in order for us to be able to get this application going. So let's go to newsapi.org. As you see here, this is where you are going to go ahead to either log in if you already have a login, or go ahead and say get API from here or from down here. But if you want to learn a little bit more about what it's happening here, it's a very simple articles or news API that allows you to fetch data. For instance, if you add a topic such as Tesla, as you can see here in this URL, then you get something like this. So a JSON that allows us to go and probe in and get information pertaining to that topic. So which is exactly what we want in this application. So it's very simple. Go ahead and say get the API. And the thing you need to do is to register in order for you to get an API. So you put your first name, your last name, and then choose a password. Make sure if you are an individual or a business, I'll just go with an individual. I think that's the easiest. And of course, you have the CAPTCHA here, agree and submit. So I'm not going to do that because I already have that API. So once you have the API, of course, as we did before, go ahead and save that API because we're going to use it shortly in our application. I have created already this news summarizer. So I've got the environment going. I have everything. I also have the requirements.txt with python.env and OpenAI, of course. And I'm going to say pip install -r, pass the requirement text, and go ahead and make sure that we have all of that installed. Okay, again, if you go to my env bin, you can see we should have .env as well as OpenAI set up for us. So the main folder or the main file, as you see here, it is essentially the same setup we had before. Okay, so just copy and paste. We have the client, instantiated our OpenAI here, and pass in the model. Of course, remember, we could change this model here to perhaps GPT-4, depending on when you're watching this video. I'm using the 3.5 Turbo 16K because that's all we need anyway, but feel free to change that. Okay, so we have all of these imported, nothing new here. So if you click here, you can see that I have the OpenAPI key. And what we'll do next is you need to add the other key, which is going to be the news API key. So here, then you can put like that and put your API key, the API key that you created. So once we have all of that, let's go back to our main, in this case to our main.py or app.py. And I'm going to put here this code. So it's going to be news API OS environment. Of course, we need to make sure that we import OS for that as well. And then it should be good. So here we are getting the news API we just created, put that into a news API key so we can use and set things up in a little bit. Okay, so once you have all of that, we should be able to get going. Now, what I'm going to do next here, I'm going to create a class that will be our manager per se, our assistant manager, which will allow us to call it and then get the assistants or create the assistant, the thread ID, and do all the things that we've seen before. Okay, so I think that's the better way to do it. Of course, we could do this in a more modular way, create the functions and do what we did before, but I think this is kind of fun. And also keep in mind that you will have access to all of this code, so it's all good. So in the bottom here, I'm going to put this piece of code, which allows us, of course, to pick up the main function. I'm going to create it here and then run whatever is here. So for now, I'm just going to say pass so that we don't have any issues. So let's go ahead and create a function, which is going to allow us to tap into the API and get some result. That is the base of this entire application. So that is the first thing we need to do. So I'm going to say get news, say define or def to define, and then I'm going to pass here the topic, which is going to be the topic we're going to pass. So first I'm going to put the URL here. So the URL that we need to tap into, essentially it's our API. So I have it already, and I'm going to put it inside of an F string and just go ahead and grab it. So essentially what I'm doing here, I have the HTTPS newsapi.org. And in this case here, the endpoint that I want is everything. Okay, there are different endpoints, but we can just focus on everything. And you can go back to the API page, which I will recommend you do to read a little bit more about all these endpoints and everything. But this should suffice. And then you have a query here and pass the topic, which is going to be passed along here. And then the API key, which is the news API key that we put together right at the top here. And of course, we're saying page size about 5 because we don't want to get more than that, because that's just a little bit too much. All right. And you can play around with the numbers and everything. That's totally fine and up to you. Now, the next thing we need to do here is let's go back to our requirements txt, and I need to pass a request package here because we're going to need that to hit our API, do the request to our API and then get the information. Okay, so let's go ahead and say pip install. Oops, let's say pip install -r requirement of text. Voila, and we should be good. We go back here. Now I can go ahead and say try, put all that inside of a try, and I'm going to say accept at the bottom here, require a request. Oh, I actually have to import requests, so import requests as such, the package, and now I can use the requests, and then exception, request exception, that's E. This is just to save us, this makes a requests, and I'm just going to say print, or rather say error occurred during API request, something like that. Okay, and then pass the E. So don't worry too much, it's just an exception here because we're going to put some code inside of the try here, so that if something happens, at least we have a way of handling our errors, right? Probably there are better ways of doing this, but this is fine. All right, so now inside here, we are going to do the fetching of the response from our API. I'm going to put in a response variable, and I'm going to say requests.get in this case, and pass the URL. That's how easy really it is to use requests to go and fetch some data from the API. So now that we have our response here, I'm going to put some if statements here just to make sure things are okay. So I'm going to say if response status, because the response will have this status code in this case. If our status code is okay, in this case it's just 200, which means everything okay. And then I'm going to be able to parse through our JSON. So I'm going to say news, and then I'm going to transform that into JSON, which means we need to import JSON as such. I'm going to say JSON dumps, and I'm going to pass our response.json as such. And of course I can say indentation about 4 as the JSON comes in, so to make the actual JSON looks a little bit better. Okay, have our object here, which is going to be our payload with all the news. So the next thing we will do here, just to make things simpler, is we are going to transform this JSON here. We say JSON dumps, which if you hover over what it says here, it says serialize object to a JSON format string. So this is just a format JSON string. Now we need to actually convert that string into a Python dictionary. That way we're going to be able to access some of the fields easily. So I'm just going to say news JSON, and then use JSON package again and say loads, and then pass our new, this should be news, not new, but either way works. Okay, pass our news here. All right, there we go. So now this is easy for us to work with, which is exactly what we want. And then I'm going to say data. I'm going to say news JSON here, just to pass things around a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and here I'm going to go ahead and access all the fields, essentially loop through, right? Loop through the JSON and extract all the things that we want. Okay, so if we go back to the news API, of course we have to get started, documentation, everything. But if you look here, you can see the payload, how it looks, right? So all the payload will more or less look like this, okay, which is really cool. And also you can scroll left and down. You can scroll left to see different endpoints, top headlines. We have here top headlines still, and there we go. This is the everything endpoint that we are using, and with some modification to get the data that we're looking for. And so it will look essentially the same. The payload, you can see here we have status, it's an object, a JSON object. So in this case, it's just an object. We have the status, okay, results 254, and then we have this articles array, which then we have the source and the author. So each article is an object itself with all the information and has author, title, description, and URL to image, and all of these fields. Okay, so we're going to extrapolate some of these fields so that we can get the information that we need, because we don't need everything from these from the payload. So essentially we're going to loop through our payload and get the and access the fields and get the information that we actually need. So before we even go through the for loop, let's go ahead and get some of the most important fields. So I'm going to start with status, and this status is going to be this status we're going to get from data and go to status field. Here, so you can see we have the object, go to status and get the status field. In this case, you're just going to say okay. Okay, we got that. And let's get the total results. In this case, I'm going to say it's going to be data. And then I believe it's just total. We're going down here and get the total result, which will say how many articles are in this payload. And then we're going to go to articles to get the actual articles. So we're going to go through data again. We're going back to get this array, which will contain all of the articles as objects, or dictionary in Python. Okay, so we just say articles. So this is exactly what we want. Make sure that these names are exactly the same, because these are our fields, which are our IDs, for us to be able to get what we need. I think I got everything right. So I got all the articles. So now is when I'm going to loop through the articles and get the information that I want. So the first thing I'm going to say for article in articles, very simple loop here. So what we want to do is, again, go and get the information that we want from each article. What we want is the source and get the name. And then we may need the author, the title of the article, of course, and the description. We may need some other things here. And we may need the content on other things. So we're just going to go ahead and extrapolate a few of these fields. Name, in this case, is going to be going to articles, or article in this case for each article. And I'm going to go to source and go through and get the name. All right, do the same to others. So I'm going to get the author. So article, author, and title. There we go. And what else? I need description, which is going to be article and description. And what else? Let's get the URL, because we may need that, the URL to the article itself. And it's going to be URL. Okay, let's go ahead and get the content. Okay, what else? So that's good. Then here at the bottom, I'm going to put all of that into a string, so it's easy for us to use it. So I'm going to say, call this title, description. I'm going to put all of that into an F string, just to facilitate everything, really. And then here's what's going to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and concatenate all of these different pieces that we put together here, we received, into a long, nice string. So first I'm going to put the title, and then put a text title that says title first. And then I'm going to say author. So get the author field that we just got from here. And what else? Let's go ahead and get, let's say source name in this case, and description, and let's go ahead and get URL. Okay, so now we have this long string that has all this information that we pulled from the API. Looking good. And the next thing we'll do here is that I'm going to actually put that into an array, because each one of these string that contains title, author, source name, description, URL, we know that we're inside of a for loop. We want to do that for each one of these articles that we're getting. And so I'm going to go ahead and create an empty list here, say final news. That way I can pass all of that each time we'll loop through. Okay, so right below here, I'm going to say final news. I'm going to append our description. So title, description. Maybe I should have named it better, but that's okay. Okay, so each time we do that, we are going to pull in all of the title description, which we are getting all of the title, author, source name, description, and URL for each article as we loop through. Okay, all of that, so that way we can actually return that array, so we see all of the information, in this case, all of the news that we want. So at the bottom here, I'm going to go ahead and just say return the final news. Okay, let me go ahead and move this, because this is an if statement. I can say return else. In this case, if indeed response status code is not 200, meaning we have some issues, we're just going to go ahead and return, in this case, an empty array or list like this. All right, very good. So what we'll do now is let's go ahead and call our get news and pass a topic here that says Bitcoin, just to see what will happen. Let's go ahead and quickly run this. So I'm going to say Python 3. I am on Mac, so on Windows or Linux, you have to do something else, I believe. And let's call main. Let's give it a run. Hopefully everything works. Looks like it's running, but it's not showing anything. That is because I need to actually put that into a variable. Say news, and then say print news like this. Okay, let's see if this works. Let's run again. And as you see, we're getting some information. And the great thing is, because it's an array that we should be getting, yes, a list. I keep saying array, it's a list in Python, but same thing. You can see we have the square brackets there. And of course, I can go ahead and get just the first item in our list if I wish to do so. And let's run again. We should get just one. So we can see exactly that we have a title and description, author, source, and all that great stuff in URL. And that's exactly what we want. So there we go. So we have all the articles that we want. We just got the pieces that we want and created one long string and put that in an array each time we call get news. So this is good news. I think this says that this tells us that we're able to fetch news from our API and get the data that we want for what we're going to be doing next. So now that we know that the get news works, by the way, we'll see later, this get news, this is the function that we're going to be using. You will see in a bit here as the function calling functionality we talk about with Assistants API, which is pretty cool. Okay, so now we have that working. We're able to pass in this case, a topic, and then we receive the news, right? And then we formatted everything, we got what we need, and all is good. So we're going to use that as our function calling. Very cool. All right, so next what we'll do here is, as I said before, we are going to actually create a class. This is going to be a manager, an assistant manager class, where we're going to put everything in that one class. Okay, so now we could have done this just putting functions, modularly, but this is, I think, is the best way. Okay, to do it. This is probably the better way for us to have everything in one place, in one class, so we can instantiate that class as an object and then get what we want from that. Let's do that. So I'm going to create a class here. So say class and call this AssistantManager, such. All right, very good. And so I'm going to add a few fields for our class here. The first field that we need is going to be the thread ID. And for now, I'm going to say none. And then I need the assistant ID, which is also going to be none, like this. Have a constructor or initializer, depending on which programming language you're coming from. So we're going to say define, and this is going to be the init, and it passed the self, and it's returning, in this case, nothing. Just to simplify things, of course, I'm going to pass a few parameters here. So it's going to self. I'm going to pass also the model, which is going to be a string. Okay, and just in case, I'm just going to go ahead and pass our model that we passed at the top here. We created at the top here. We have a default value, which is going to be the model GPT-3 or whatever model you added here. And I'm just going to remove that. And next, I am going to then set up a few things for our class here in our constructor, in our initializer. Okay, so I'm going to say self. And I'm going to call the client, because I want the client to be, in this case, OpenAI, that OpenAI as such, just to instantiate all of that. Or I could have just called our client here. That would work as well. So either way works. I'm just going to pass client like this, which is going to be, in this case, our client. And then, of course, self.model. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and say model. whatever we're passing along here, and then self, what else? That assistant is going to be none in the beginning, and self dot thread also is going to be none, and self dot run, right, is none as well. The other thing I'm going to add here, because I want to be able to have the actual summary, because that's the whole goal, is that this class is going to be able to give us the summary of the news from the topic that we paste in or enter. So I'm going to create, yes, another field here called summary, okay, which in the beginning is going to be equal to none, like that. So now we're going to do some if statements here to actually check if some of these fields like assistant and thread, but more particularly if these static fields here, thread ID and assistant IDs, if they're existent, that way we can then look at that and see whether we need to create a new assistant or just use the existing ID. Because the idea is that as we run this the first time, as you saw before, we will have the assistant ID at least, as well as a third ID, and so that we don't run this many times and then recreate the same things in the backend in the console or in the playground. We want to make sure that those things are set up so that we don't have copies of the assistant and IDs and so forth. So still inside of our init here, I'm going to say if AssistantManager dot thread, in this case, let's start with assistant ID. So if we have an assistant ID, that means we have an assistant. In that case, we are going to set our assistant to the assistant that we already have. So I'm going to say self that client that beta assistants, and then I'm going to retrieve that assistant. And to retrieve that assistant, we need to say pass, of course, the ID of that assistant. So we're just going to say assistant ID is equal to manager, assistant manager, and get that assistant ID as such. And also we're going to check for our thread ID, just if we have a thread ID. So assistant manager that thread ID. If that's the case, we're going to do the same thing we did, which is we're going to go ahead and get the thread ID. So self assistant, or thread ID I should say, and set that up with the self.client beta threads, and retrieve, in this case, thread ID. It's going to be to AssistantManager. Or I could have said self, but that's okay. Thread ID as such. Okay. All right. Very good. So now we are making sure that indeed, if we have an assistant ID, then we don't create a new assistant ID. In this case, we just go ahead and retrieve the assistant that we have. Okay. The same thing with the thread ID. Okay. So all of that is inside of our init function here, our constructor. Next, we're going to define a new method here called create assistant. So this will allow us to create an actual assistant. So I'm going to pass self, name, and instructions, as well as tools, because those are the things that any assistant, as you know by now, may need when we create an assistant. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to go ahead and put an if statement here. So if not self, that assistant, right? So if there's no assistant, of course, then what I'm going to do, I'm going to create an assistant. Let's say assistant object, essentially, which is going to be self, that client, that beta, that assistants, and then I'm going to create a new assistance, essentially. So to do that, we need to pass name, which is going to be name. We need to pass the instructions, which is going to be instructions that we are passing along, right? And then we're going to pass also tools, and pass the tools as such. And for completion, we're also going to pass model, and we're going to say self.model. So to get the model that we already have in our constructor, in our class at the top there. Okay, very good. So that's how we would create an assistant if we didn't have an assistant. Okay, so now that we know that we've created the assistant object here, next I'm going to say assistant manager. That assistant ID, I'm going to grab that ID, and then I'm going to get that from our assistant object, that ID, like that. And then I'm going to make sure that the class field has that ID. okay, the assistant ID. So I'm going to use self assistant is going to be, and then I'm going to set up the assistant field, which is usually none in the beginning, to the assistant that we just created here, which is going to be this assistant object. All right, so self that assistant now is equal to our assistant object. Very good. So if you want, we can just print things out here so that we can debug and see what's going on. So I'm going to say assist ID, just put something more there so we can see what's going on. And then I'm going to put, say, self.assist ID. Oh, I actually could just go assistant.id like this, right, to get the actual assistant ID when that is created. That's why we're saying this. All right. Very good. And that's it for create assistant. Okay, so next what we'll do is we are going to then define another function or method in this case. This is going to be called create thread. Of course, I'm going to pass self. So we have that reference as such. So you can see really nothing is out of this world. The process is still the same. It's just that I've changed a few things so that we have an actual class that helps do all the things in one place, so we can just instantiate that class and get what we need. All right, so the same thing really. If not, in this case, self.thread. So if there's nothing there, then that means we need to create a thread object. Okay, so something self.client and then threads, and then I'm going to create a thread. And as you know now, to create a thread, we just need to pass, we don't actually need to pass anything, which actually I'm going to just leave as is. So we're going to create an object thread and we can attach messages and whatever we need later. All right, so now that we have that thread, we're going to use AssistantManager just like what we did before, and say thread ID. It's going to be equal to thread object.id. Okay, set that up, and then we're going to set the field, the class field, self.thread, okay, to be equal to the thread object. Again, we're going to go ahead and print f string here. I can say thread ID just to make things better, and just pass here self.thread.id. All right, so just print that out so we have it and make sure that we are getting what we need. So now we have created the create assistant method. We also have, in this case, the create thread method. Now we need to add messages to that thread. So I'll define another function here. Say add message to thread. Okay, so we're going to pass here, first of all, self reference and the role, as well as the content. All right, in order to create that message, because we know messages are added into a thread, so we need to make sure that we indeed have a thread ID. So I'm going to say if self.thread, we have that, and then we're going to go ahead and self.client beta.threads messages, and we're going to create that message. All right, to create that message, we need a thread ID, which is going to be, in this case, self.thread.id, and then we need the role, which is going to be the role, okay, which is going to be passing when we call this create a message or add message to thread, as well as the content, okay, and pass the content as such, which has been passed along. That's it. All right, so we have that function, or in this case a method, and next we need, of course, a way for us to run the assistant. So I'm going to define another method here. So this is going to be run assistant, and we're going to pass self-reference and instructions as well. Okay, so how do we do that? Again, we're going to check. It's always important to check, because in order to run an assistant, we need, of course, to check if there's a thread ID as well as the assistant. Okay, so if self.thread and self.assistant, if they are existent, then we are safe to run this thread. So self.run, in this case, I'm going to set that to self.client, go to beta, say threads and runs, create. Okay, so we have create here. So what we need to do, we need to pass a few things. Obviously, we need to pass the thread ID. How do we get that? We get that by saying self again, right? The reference of this class, and we go and get the thread ID, thread.id as such. And then we need to pass the assistant ID, do the same thing, and we can pass the instructions, which are the instructions that we're passing as parameters. Okay, so our class is actually coming along nicely. Next, we are going to define yet another method here called process messages, because we need a way, as you know, to process those messages, going through all of that stuff and retrieve what we need. All right, so I'm going to pass here just the self reference. Okay, let's go ahead and work on this bad boy. So what do we need now here in process message? Well, first of all, I'm going to check if there is a thread, because we know that messages are inside of our thread. So we need to check if there is indeed a working thread in order for us to go in and get that information, which are the messages. So if thread, or self, I guess, or self.thread, if that's existent, if that exists, then I'm going to go say in messages, I'm going to retrieve those messages. So self, I'm going to go client, beta for now. That may change by the time you watch this video, this lessons. And I'm going to say threads, messages, and we know that comes in a list. So let's go to the list. And in this case, we need to pass the thread ID, which is going to be self.thread.id. Very good. I'm going to create a list, an empty list, because that's where we're going to add all of the messages, or summary in this case, right? So I'm going to say summary, an empty list. Is it an empty list as such? And I'm going to just go ahead and get the last message of the thread, because that's all that we need. So I'm going to say last message. And how do we get that? We say messages, because this is indeed the list, right? And then get, go to data, right? That's the object. And then get the first one, 0. And I need to get the role. We get the role from the message, in this case, payload, which is a dictionary really that we're receiving. We say messages again. Actually, since we already have the last message here, we just probe into that and say content. Okay, and of course get the first index and go to text and value as such. Value. Okay, so now we get the, actually, this is not role, this is going to be the response. All right, but I want the role, which is going to be, I'm going to do the same thing. So last message, dot content, I believe, get the 0, and then I need, no, actually I can get that straight to role, I think. Yeah, there we go. So you can see IntelliSense is helping me. Very good. So we got the last message, the big object, because we know that the messages come in a list. So we're probing in and getting exactly what we need. So we need the last message in the list, in the messages list that we got from our thread.messages. And then we get the role, just need the role so we can use it in a bit here, and the response that we're getting. All right. So that we can formulate and create a nice response. All right, so we have the response now. I'm going to go ahead and say print, in this case, put inside of an F string here, just for us, say summary, and put a lot of information like that. That way we know exactly what's what. And I'm going to say role. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and capitalize the role, right? Response, like that. So we're just printing out the summary, and at the top I'm going to put the role. So it says, for instance, user or assistant. In this case, it's going to be assistant, right? And then we have our response there. Okay. So what are we going to do before even that? We have this summary here, right? Which is an empty array. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say summary dot append and pass in our response. So now our summary, when we return, because this is going to return something, I'm going to return real quick here. This is going to return our summary. So now that our summary will have the response, which is exactly what we need. This is going to be the assistant response, right? We're processing messages. So what we'll do next? Well, you remember at the top of our class here, we have this field called summary that we're initializing here to none. So now we can fill that summary with the summary that we got here. So all I'm going to do here now, I can say self.summary, and I'm going to just then say summary like that. Okay, but I want actually to make it a little bit better, which means we're going to format things a little bit. So first I'm going to put a new line every time before we add the actual summary, the actual text, in this case this summary that we get as a response. And then I'm going to call the join and then pass the summary as such, okay, which is what we have here, a list which will contain, in this case, the summary, which will contain the assistant response. Okay, so now our field summary in this class, we should have whatever we're getting when we process and get all of the messages. One other thing we could have done, we could have looped through these messages here because it's a list, right? We could have said something like this: for MSG in messages, right? We could have say role, set that to MSG.role, okay? And then content, set that to MSG, go to content, say text, and get the value as such. And then we're going to print, in this case, I'm just going to copy this, something like that, say summary, and instead role, passing the role, and also then pass in the content like this. So this also would have worked, but because this is a method and we want something else to happen, I prefer to do what I just did here, but I'm just going to comment this out so you have access to that if you wish to just look at things in this perspective. Next, we are going to create another function, another method here real quick. So we're still inside of our class. It's hard to see everything because I needed to make the text a little bit larger so you're able to see. I'm going to say def to define. This is going to be wait for completed, and pass self as well. Get this function here or method will, as the name implies, wait for completed and do what needs to be done. So essentially we're going to make sure that as we invoke the run entity to run our assistant and do all the things that need to be done, and as you remember, when we run, we have to go through certain steps, right? Those steps may take a little bit, so we're going to configure things along that way. We can wait for a few milliseconds or seconds until we get the response, and then we do something for it. Okay, so it's just more of a helper function, in this case method, which we saw before, but now I'm putting that inside of this class. So I'm going to check, of course, to see if there is a thread and also if there is a run entity that was created. So if self that thread and self that run, okay, I'm going to put in a while loop here, while true, then we're going to go ahead and I'm going to say time.sleep for about 5 seconds, okay, and then run status. I'm going to retrieve the run status to see where we are by saying self. Again, go to client and go to threads and runs and retrieve. Okay, so in this case here, I need to pass a few things. First of all, we need the thread ID, which we can get by saying self that thread, get the ID. And then we also need the run ID, which we can get by self that run that ID. Remember, at this point here, all of these fields are of course part of our class, the run and thread and all of that. So that's very good. That's the beauty of putting everything into a class where we have one entity which we can use to do things. So, all right, so now that we have indeed our run status, we can check that. And for now, I'm going to just go ahead and print something here. Put an F string, I'm going to just say run status. And then I'm going to say run status. We can use the model. We're going to go ahead and say model dump JSON function there. And then we can just add some indentation in our JSON for readability. Just say for as such. Very good. So we are going to go ahead and get this run status, which is going to be a lot of information. We are invoking the model dump JSON, which if you hover over tells exactly what it does, generates JSON representation of the model using Pydantics and so forth. All right, very good. And there we go. So that's going to be printed out. Check the status, because remember the status has certain booleans that tells us where we are in the process of running these steps, right? So we want to check if, for instance, the status is completed or not. So I'm going to say if run status, that status is completed as such, and that's the case, then I'm going to say self the process message, right? We're going to call our function or method that we created here, the process message, which will know how to process the messages, because that means the running is completed. We should have an answer, right? Which is good. Okay, so the process message is called, and then we're just going to go ahead and break. Now, one thing I want you to remember or to keep in mind, let's go back to our presentation here. So when we looked at this diagram here, where we have essentially talking about the benefits of the Assistants API, we said that the most exciting thing really is the fact that we have tools. So in this case here, we have the code interpreter, which we saw a little bit. We have the knowledge retrieval, which allows us to upload files, and then we can converse with those files or documents, in addition to the base knowledge that the models has. But the function calling as well, okay? Right, this is where we are. We are going to implement the function calling. How does that work? Well, in this case here, if we look at our code here, when the status is completed, then we know we have the messages, so we can go ahead and process those messages. But there's also another status that we can look for or watch for, which is the requires action. Because of the function calling, as we go through all these steps we saw before, remember this? So the steps that the run goes through, you can use code interpreter, create a message, and then call another tool. In this case, we're calling a function because it is indeed another tool. When that happens, when we get to that part, the run entity will know that, okay, something is required. So it's going to trigger a flag that says the status now is requires action. When there is this requirement of required action, that means we can then call a function, do a function call. Okay, so that is the beauty here. So we can actually look for that. So I'm going to say else if run status, that status is equal, voila, you can see it even gives us all of these enums here, right? So we have the requires action, right? These are enums that are actually we can get, right? Flags essentially that we can get from the run status. So there is requires action, which is what we need. There is queued, in progress, failed, expired, canceled, cancel or canceling, or cancel, and so forth. So all of these are steps, or these are states that we can check each time to do certain things. So if the status says it's been canceled or canceling, in the process of canceling, then we can tell the user or send out a message, say, hey, now this has been canceling, so do something else. If it's failed, of course, we can do something else. If it expired, and so if it's in progress, we can also maybe show something for the user interface to say, hey, things are in progress, so just give it a minute. Okay, so this is real cool. So we want the requires action, because this is what will allow us to then do the function calling, right? Which in this case, I will tell you now, it's going to be the function that I told you earlier, that we created earlier, which is this get news. But we'll get there, okay? So if this is the status, requires action, what we'll do then, we'll do a few things. First of all, I'm going to just go ahead and print here so we see what's happening. I'm going to say function calling now, because that's what we need to happen. What we do next is we are going to go and say self, and then we're going to call this call required functions, should be function, that's fine, because you can call more than one function. So say functions. I'm going to pass self and required actions. Okay, we haven't created that. Let's go ahead and create this actions. That's that. And all this will do, I'm going to say if not self that run, right? If run is not available, or so all I'm going to do here, if not self that run, then I'm just going to head and return, right? Because there's nothing really to do. And in any other case, I'm going to just say tools outputs, and it's going to be an empty array. So this tools outputs here is what we're going to use to go through and pull in all of the required tools, in this case required functions that we need for this to run. So let's work on this a little bit here. Okay, the thing to remember here, because this required action here is going to be a list. That's why it says actions plural. So I'm going to put a for loop here. That's a for action in required actions, and inside of this required actions, actually we are going to have tools calls as such, and then inside I'm going to go ahead and get the function name. So I'm going to say func name, and then I'm going to say action, and then I'm going to go ahead and say function. Okay, and then I'm going to go and get the actual name. So that's what we're doing here. So we're going to get through this required tools, but we're going to have a lot of different tools. We may have more than one tool, of course, in this case more than one function. Okay, and then we're going to loop through and just get all of the names of the functions, but in this case we're just going to have one, so we get the name and put that in function name. So if the function name, which is going to be a tool, is get news, then we're going to get the actual name of the function, because that's what we need to pass around to get, in this case, to get it so that the function can run and then get the data, pull it back, then the assistant knows what to do. Very good. And then I'm going to say arguments. I'm going to say JSON, in this case, loads, and then I'm going to pass the action. So essentially, exactly what I have here. I'm just copy this, change a few things, and instead of function name, we're going to get the arguments, the function arguments. So all we're doing here is going through, get the function and get the arguments of that function, because they may have some arguments that need to be passed around. Okay, and that's what I'm doing. So I'm going to put that into a variable arguments. Okay, so we'll see how it all pans out. Now I'm going to put an if statement here. So I'm going to say if func name is equal, in this case I know it's going to be get news. Now how do I know this? Well, I know this because that's the function I need to be called as a function calling. It's called get news. If you said happy birthday or James Bond, whatever you named here, this has to be exactly the same, because that's what we're going to be calling, right? So if function name is get news in this case, then what we'll do, well, we're going to put inside of we're going to say output, and I'm going to call get news. Aha, now I'm actually calling the function and passing the topic. How do I get the topic? Well, I get the topic because I have the arguments. Remember when we did this here, we're getting the arguments of the function. So we need to pass the actual arguments here like that. Okay, now what is the arguments? Now the cool thing is that when you go back to this get news here, the argument name is topic, right? So in this case here, I need to say, well, the arguments, because it's going to come in as just a dictionary, it's going to be topic as such. Very, very important. So whatever you put inside our get news function when you call the argument has to be passed along like this. Very good. So that is part of the function calling, guys. All right. So now that we have the output, because the get news is going to return something, or is going to give us something, right? And we have that there as an output. Now I'm going to go ahead and print that just so we have it. I have string here. Just say stuff. Okay, to differentiate things. And I'm going to say output like this, because we know that the get news will return that very nice string, right? Remember, let's go back here. You can see I'm going to open this. So we return this final news, which is going to be a string, but in this case it's just going to be a list containing all of those different news, right? Because we listed everything, we put everything in one string, and we'll loop through. So each news that we're getting, we're going to get a title, author, source, description, URL, and so forth, and put that in final news list, right? So in this case here, what we'll do is we are going to loop through, and so that we can create the actual final string. So I'm going to loop through and extract everything from the list, because that's what's been returned from our get news. And then I'm going to put everything in a very long string. That way it's easier for the LLM, for the model in this case, to be able to just pick all that stuff and summarize it and create some sort of a new summary of everything, if that makes any sense. Okay, so structuring things for us. So I'm going to say final string, str, just make it an empty string as such. And then I'm going to say for item in output. Then we're going to do something. So I'm just going to append, like I said, to create a long string. So final string plus equal, I'm going to just say that join and pass, in this case, our item. Okay, now we have this final string ready for us to use. All right. Okay, so you notice here we also have what we call this tools output. It should be tool outputs. So our tools output here is just an empty list. So we're going to use that because that's where we're going to add all of the tool outputs. So I'm going to say tool outputs in this case and append what? Well, I'm going to append an object or a dictionary that will have a few things. First of all, let me just put it all together here so you can see. First of all, I'm going to say tool and call ID like that. And then for the call ID, so how do I get the call ID? Well, a call ID, it's going to be coming from our action. If I say action, right? What is the action? Well, action is this because we're still inside our for loop, right? So it's going to go through all the tool calls. So I'm going to get each one of the action, which is essentially the action part of the function, right? The function call. And I'm going to go ahead and get the ID. So I'm going to say like this and say ID. So I'm getting the tool call ID. In this case, in this case, essentially it's just the function calling, right? Say output. This is going to be the output that comes from our get news. So what I'm going to do, well, I already have this final string here. So that's what I'm going to put here. So I'm going to say final string like that. Very good. Now this tool outputs is very important, as you can see in a little bit here. So now that we have our tool outputs with stuff, that means each time we go through, it's going to go ahead and get all of the tools. In this case, it's just one function. You could have other tools, right? We're doing function calling here. It's going to go ahead and get the action ID and get the final string, which is what we get from our output when we call the actual function, the actual tool. This is our tool, right? Very good. So next, what we do, I'm just going to go ahead and print something here so we see what's happening. I'm going to say submitting outputs back to the assistant. That's what we'll do next right here. So now before I do that, actually, I'm going to say something like else, because we're inside of if statement, if the function name is get news, right? So if anything else happens, I'm going to just say raise value error. And I can just say something like an F string here, unknown function, and then I'm going to just put the func name as such, okay, just to save ourselves from a lot of issues. So I'm going to get out of our if or for loop that is here, because all of that has to be inside our for loop. And now I'm going to say submitting outputs back to the assistant. So what we'll do next is, this is the beauty. I'm going to say self client beta and then threads and runs and submit tool. So there is such function or such, and so there is such function called submit tools output or tool outputs. That's why we were doing all of this, because now we have to pass along a few things in order for the run, in this case here, to be able to go and get the tools, because at this point it's saying, hey, we need some tools, right? Tools required, right? In order for that to happen, then we need to pass a few things. It needs to know about the thread ID, which we can get from our thread.id, right? It needs to know about the run ID. All right, so I'm going to say can know about self.run.id. It also needs to know about the tools outputs. And where do we get those? Well, tool outputs, which is exactly what we've been working on around here. Now we have tool outputs, we'll have tool call ID, and it has to be exactly like this, because that is what's required. And the action ID, we're passing tool call it. Saying, right, we're going to have here tool call ID, which needs to be passed exactly like this in this dictionary. And if it's going to be action ID, and output is going to be the final string, which is exactly what we have here, which is the information coming from our get news. Very cool. Very cool. All right. Now, indeed, if we go back to where we were calling this will make more sense. Now I don't need to pass that at all, nor do I need to pass that. Let's see, what do I need to pass? So now this makes sense. That means now when status requires action, we are going to call required functions, which is what we just did. So it's going to go through and go and get all the tools. In this case, it's just going to go ahead and say, okay, so we need a function in this case, but because it could be more than one function, because it's a tool itself, go through all the process. We make sure that the function name is exactly the name that we created at the top, as I showed you, and then we get the output from that function, because those results are needed, right, for the run to process everything, and we do all this great work, and then we make sure that then we submit those tools, as you see here, okay, to our runs as submit tool function. You need to pass the thread ID as well as run ID always. All right, very cool. All right, so there we go. That is exactly what's happening here. And so now we should be able to have everything that we need to get things going. But before we go that, we need to pass something else here. It says here, required actions. So we need to pass the required action here. How do we do that? Well, it's going to be, I'm going to say required actions, and it's going to be run status that required action submit tool outputs, and I'm going to say model dump, like that. So essentially, we are just getting the submitted tools, and of course, we are going to go ahead and generate in this case. And of course, we're going to make it so that it is indeed a model dump. So create a Python dictionary, which is needed so that the call required function knows how to read all of that stuff, which is needed, that is needed for the function calling to actually work. Okay, so what I want you to do is to, if this is not making a lot of sense, it's okay. Rewatch this part a few times until you understand it. The main thing to keep in mind here is that all of that is being called inside of wait for completed, because that's where all the action is. And we are setting up, or we are listening, right? Looking for the status. If it's completed, then we just are good. We go ahead and process message. In cases, which is this case here, where status says requires action, that's when we call required functions, right? Because this, again, I'll repeat myself, I know, but I want you to understand, this is where all the getting the function name, getting the IDs, the action ID and everything, and actual calling our function as a tool, this is where everything happens. And it's very important to make sure that we get the arguments and pass the actual arguments which are passed along when we call that function which we created, the get news, and make sure the function name is getting there and everything is good and life is great. All right, so that's very important to keep in mind. Now, I know it was a little bit of working that needed to be done, but that's how you do function calling with the Assistants API. Next, we are going to create yet another function here, or method I should call it, because it's inside of a class. This is going to be for Streamlit, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. This is going to be our front end, right? I'm going to say here for Streamlit. So essentially, we're going to define a method here called get summary, pass self, and all it will do is this is going to go ahead and return self.summary as such. Okay, that's all this function is doing here, and it's going to be more apparent once we are putting together the front end with Streamlit. Okay, so the next method we're going to create here is the run method. So run the steps. It's going to define this run steps, reference self, and I'm going to say run steps. Self.client, go to threads, runs, and steps as such, and pass in the list. And we've seen this before, so we are going to, of course, go through the run steps and get all that information. For that, we need to pass the thread ID, as you know. So thread self, of course, get the ID, as well as the run ID. So it's going to be self run.id. Okay, very good. And so we're going to go ahead and print, in this case, an F string, say run steps, and pass in our run steps so we can see what's going on. This is just for us. Okay, so I think these are all the methods that we need. We have a few here. So we have the call required functions. We have the process message. We have the run assistant. These are very important because allow us to actually create assistants, which is the most important thing really, and add to thread. But before that, we have the create thread and create assistant. Which one was this? This was run assistants, of course, to run an assistant. And we have the create assistant. This is the one I wanted to talk about. And voila. So we have our class here, AssistantManager, which we can instantiate as an object, and we're going to be able to run and create assistants and do all the things that we've done before, but in a different, more object-oriented way of doing things. And most importantly, that we know that indeed the get news, which we tested earlier here, this is a tool that's going to be using in the process in the function calling tool, as we discussed. So very exciting. Okay, so now I think it's time for us to test this out. So let me move this main to the bottom, right about here. And so I'm going to comment this. Let's comment this out as well as that. Of course, for testing. And first of all, we are going to go ahead and say a manager, create a variable manager, and then instantiate our assistant manager as such. Okay, very clean. And what we'll do next is we are going to be using Streamlit, which will allow us to create a web page where we can actually see things happening. So it's very simple. And of course, I'm going to go up here and go to requirements. And I'm going to go ahead and say Streamlit such, and make sure that I run again pip install -r requests requirements a text, so we can pull in this Streamlit package. Okay, so it looks like we've gotten everything. Let's make sure it should be fine. Let's see, Streamlit is there. That's very exciting. Really good. So let me clear this, and now I can go ahead and we can now use Streamlit. Again, if you don't know what Streamlit is, again, Streamlit is just a very simple framework that you can use, a Python framework that you can use to quickly generate web pages with Python. It's really beautiful. Create a Streamlit interface, so we can actually create a user interface. Of course, that's what it does. I'm going to use Streamlit. First of all, I need to go ahead and import Streamlit as st for Streamlit. Okay. So now I can set things up here. I'm going to start by putting the title. So st title. It's going to be news summarizer. And then I'm going to add here a form, which will allow us to add a field where we can, in this case, add where we can type, where users can type in the topic. So I'm going to say with st.form, and for any form we need to pass a key. Okay, so I'm going to just call it user input form, and then I'm going to pass instructions here. I'm going to st that text area. So we can actually create a text area or text input. I'm going to just use text area because it's cool. And I'm going to say what I want the text to show here is going to be enter topic. Maybe text area is too much. Let's just say that text input. Okay, that's probably better. All right. And we're going to also create a submit button as such. And I'm going to st.form submit button. I'm going to pass a label, which is going to be just a string. I'm going to say run assistant. And now we need to be able to handle the button. Let me see something here. I'm going to run this real quick just to see if something's going to happen. Now, in order for us to run a Streamlit application, we no longer say Python. We say Streamlit run and then the name of the file. Hit enter. And if all is well, what will happen? A new window is going to open. Okay, so you can see I have it open now. It looks really nice. And news summarizer, we can enter something and we have the button here. So just like that, we're able to create a user interface that looks wonderful. Next, let's go ahead and handle this submit button because we want once the submit button is clicked, something needs to happen. So I'm going to say if submit button. In this case, that's how you handle submits. We're going to go ahead and create an assistant and thread if they don't exist. So I'm going to call the manager because we instantiated here. And I'm going to say dot create assistant. Look how beautiful this is because now we can just go ahead and call those methods, right? The function in this case from our manager object class that we created. And for that, we need to pass a few things. I'm going to pass the name. The name is going to be news summarizer as such. And then I'm going to pass instructions, and I already have those instructions. I'm just going to copy and add them here. So that way we don't have to do all of this. Okay, so essentially it says here you are a personal article summarizer assistant who knows how to take a list of articles, title and descriptions, and then write a short summary of all the news articles. Now, the most important thing here is that we need to pass the tools list, right? So the list is going to go in as an object or a dictionary in this case, and we need to pass a few things here. So now I have all of that already, and you'll have access to all of that. This is the dictionary that you need to pass in for our function calling to work. So inside of the tools, you say this. So we have the type, it's going to be function. The function, we're going to get the name is get news. Remember, it has to be the same name of the function we created earlier. Get news, very important. And then the description, we can add a description here for that function. We have the parameters, and then we have the parameters, and then we have the parameters field, which is an object or dictionary. It's going to be an object, the property, and importantly, notice here the property is the topic. This is the argument, right? So topic is going to be type of string, and we need to pass the description of that property, which is topic. Remember, we're adding topic because that was the argument we're passing. It has to be exactly the same name. This is very important. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Okay? And so we pass the description, the topic for the news, for example, Bitcoin and so forth. Now, the important part here is that required, because this is going to be the argument parameter. As you see, this is part of parameters, and that is required, which is going to be the topic. Notice these are the same names as the arguments or parameters we passed in the function. Okay, so when we click the button, then we're going to create an assistant, and then also we are going to go ahead and create right below that. We're going to go ahead and create the actual thread because that is needed, right? To create a thread, we're going to use manager again, and then invoke the function or run the function or call the function, create thread. We don't have to pass anything. And next, we're going to go ahead and add the message and run the assistant as such. How do you do that? Well, we're going to use manager again. This is the beauty of having that class, right? And call the add message to thread function. And then here we need to pass the role. The role is going to be user. Content, it's going to be, I'm going to pass in as an F string. So I'm going to copy what I have here already so it's easier. So for content, it says summarize the news on this topic and pass in the instructions. Now, where is this instructions coming from? Well, this is the instructions we're getting from the text input. Very good. once we've added that message, this is going to be a message to the thread, right? What we need to do then is just say manager that run assistant, right? That method, and pass in the instructions, which is going to be summarize the news. Okay, you can be more elaborate, but that's okay. And once we have that, then we are going to wait for completion and process then the messages. Okay, so I'm going to call manager again, say wait for completed. It's called wait for completed. It should be wait for completion. So we have that. So change that. So that wait for completion. And then we're going to have a summary here, which then I'm going to call the manager dot get summary, because at this point we should have a summary. And once we have this summary, we can then say st for Streamlit and write that summary, okay, into our page. And then st, again, I'm going to add a text here, which is going to be the run steps. And then I'm going to st that code. So this is just going to show the run steps at the bottom. And then I'm going to call manager that run steps function, which we created, right? It's going to just go ahead and show all these steps. And I want this line numbers to be true as such. That's about it. So we are now calling everything. First of all, we created the assistant. Make sure that we pass the tools, which is going to be a function calling tool essentially. And then we create the thread that's needed. And then once the thread is created, we are going to create, in this case, call the add message to thread, add the user and the summarize news on this topic, which is going to be instructions, right? And we're going to run the assistant, pass the instructions. We're going to wait for completion, right? A few seconds. And then we get the summary, manager gets summary, and then we write that summary into our page. And then of course we also get the steps so we can show at the bottom. That's it. So now if I save this, go ahead and run again. I think I could go back and always rerun. Okay, let's go ahead and say OpenAI and run. All right, so after a few moments, you can see that we have here are some recent news articles about OpenAI, and goes and gets the title, How to Stop Another OpenAI Meltdown. And it's got all the main points, the author, source, description. So what happens now in the back end, the assistant was able to go and create all of this, the description as a little summary. Okay, the same thing with Wired. So everything related to the description here is indeed showing. Now it's saying none here. Maybe perhaps in the code I put something wrong, but that's okay. We can look at that a little bit later. Okay, so as you can see, this is indeed working. And if we go back to our command line here, or terminal I should say, there's a lot that has shown up here. And let's see. So we see here in one of the run status, we have the assistant ID. So I'm going to copy that assistant ID and go back to our code. And for our assistant ID here, I'm going to actually paste that in. And let's go ahead and find the thread ID. And there we go, the thread ID. Let's just copy this. And I'm going to put there. So this is what we're going to be using. Very well. So that means then I'm going to go ahead and stop this altogether, because now we're going to change gears to make sure that we don't recreate the same we don't create yet another assistant if we were to run this, in this case, adding something else. Okay, so I stop that, and this is stopped. Now if you go to OpenAI, let's go to our assistants, we should see that indeed we have this new summarizer assistant with that ID, which is the same ID that we just added, hard-coded, to make sure that everything works as intended. Okay, so now that we have actually added this thread ID as well as assistant ID, we have this code so that it will check if there's already an assistant ID. Okay. If there is an assistant ID, we just going to go ahead and retrieve that assistant, right? Say assistant, beta assistants, and retrieve. Same thing with the thread. Okay. So this is why we had this code before. So now if I save this, let's go ahead and rerun again. I'm going to refresh this. So this time here, I'm going to run again. Let's have a different topic. Let's say US inflation. Let's go ahead and run. So we'll take a few moments. And there you have it. Here are some recent news articles about US inflation. And we have the title, the author, and everything. And we do have that description, which is really nice. And we'll also have to read more. The homelessness in the US hit record high, and all this information. Very good. So we're still getting none for steps here. We can look at the code just to make sure, because for steps, I saw earlier that we should be getting something, but I think let's see. Okay, I have run steps. Let's go to our code. Okay, run steps. I'm just in run steps, self list. Right, I'm printing the run steps, and I should return, that's why, run steps like this. And of course, I can move this there, so this actually works. I can actually save this. And I'm going to probe into data to actually get the right information. All right. There we go. So now if I go back here, and I'm going to say always rerun, or just rerun one time, that's okay. And I'm going to find something else. Let's say Apple. Okay, after a little bit, you can see that indeed this is running. Here are some recent news articles about Apple, and Apple Pay, Apple Card, Apple Visa, TV, and all this great stuff. So you can see, oh, there we go. And of course, we have all the run steps, which is exactly what we want to see. And this is just for us to debug. Of course, in a final project or product, you probably shouldn't have this there, but I just want to show you. So we have this is working. If we go to our assistants, we'll see that we don't have duplicates of assistant. We just have one summarizer, because now we're able to get the assistant ID. And of course, we printed out the thread ID. So we're using those for our assistants API that we're creating here to summarize our news. Very cool. So I hope this is making sense. I hope you are seeing the power of using function calling with Assistants API. And it's part of adding more tools to the toolkit so that an assistant is able to run things and get information, extra information from somewhere else. As you can see, we're tapping into a totally different thing per se, totally different system, API in this case, to get information and pass that back through the large language model. In this case, the model that we're using, large language model that we're using here, GPT-3. We instructed it to create a summary, get that information, summarize everything, and then pass it back to the thread as the response. And that's what we're getting here. And you can see a lot of different use cases that can come up from this, right? You can create, for instance, a newsletter application that what it would do is, depending on the topic that you pass in here, it will just generate a newsletter with the main points about that topic. So the things you can do are literally endless. There's so many things you can do with this, and I hope you're seeing the power that we have here. Okay, so all of this is just using the Assistants API. Okay, so far we've done a lot of things, and the last thing we did was to create this summarizer, new summarizer, which allows us to look into passing function calls to our assistant. That way we can extend even more the toolings that we can pass to our assistant to do something else. Right. So in this case, the assistant now has this function call. We just looked at one function call, but you can have many function calls. And this is very important because that, as I said, will extend the capability of our model. Because not only can we rely only on what the large language model knows. Now we can include other tools so that the large language model, the model in this case, will have more context, more knowledge base. So that's what's all about. So it gives us that flexibility. And what I want you to do is to think about use cases that you can implement at your work or maybe in your projects. What else can you do? The example that I showed you here was tapping into, or calling in this case, an API, a news API, but you could tap into a database, for instance, or do all sort of things. So the idea is that now you have that capability and you see how function calling is really awesome when it comes to creating really powerful assistants. So next, what we'll do is we're going to look at a knowledge base retrieval tool, because now we're going to look at how to even give more context, more knowledge, specific knowledge that we would want to our model so that our assistant is able to have the knowledge to answer certain questions and get us the results that we want. Okay. What we're going to be building is what I call a study buddy. Essentially will allow us to upload certain PDF files, and then we can type questions in a chat bot and get answers pertaining to that, to those documents or that document that we have uploaded. Okay. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the background of how things work, how this retrieval thing really works, right? In the back end. So how does it work, this knowledge retrieval? The way it works is very simple. If you look at this, we have documents. A document could be whatever we upload. In this case, let's think of it as just a PDF file. Okay. So what happens now is that we pass that, or we upload that to OpenAI large language model, which has this massive knowledge base. But when we pass these documents in, that means those documents or files are now part of these large language model knowledge base. That's the whole idea. So that way, when we query or we ask questions to the model, which now understands more than what it knows because we've passed more knowledge per se, then we can get the answers. So this is what we have in a nutshell. But there's a lot of things that are happening internally here. One of the things is, if we look inside, right? So what happens now is that we're taking a document and we put it through a document splitting process. Okay, so the documents are split or cut up into smaller chunks, and then those are actually saved in what we call a vector store. Now, this is what generally happens when we talk about pushing information, in this case, documents and so forth, to the large language model so it has more context, has more knowledge. Okay. So the question here is, okay, what is this vector store and why is that even important? The thing to keep in mind here is that in a vector store, the representation of the document is not the same as we started with. So this is not even documents chunk. This is not even a document that you and I can read anymore. Now we have this different representation that we call embeddings. So what happens is that a vector store holds embeddings. So embeddings is a vector, just a mathematical representation of the text of those documents. And that is indeed what is put inside of the vector store. A vector store is just a database that holds all of this mathematical representation of our document. Now, the reason why embeddings are so important is because embeddings are, first of all, our mathematical representation, which means it's really easy for algorithms to be able, in this case, to search for whatever it's looking for the text, for the meaning, and so forth. So there's a lot more to that, but that is the idea. Because now we can look for pieces of text. In this case, we call text, but they're not necessarily text. They're mathematical representation, but let's call them text. So now it's easy to look for the pieces of text in trying to find similarities between those pieces of text, which are now embeddings. The idea, so visually again, this is what happens. So you have all the documents. So I'm putting different kind of documents, but right now we're talking about just PDF files, but it could be anything really in general. Okay. And that has to be transformed into embeddings, as I just said, which are these mathematical representation of those pieces of data, the text or the document, which we call vector representation. And that is what is pushed into this massive algorithm that will then know how to do the similarity search to find the right result per se. Okay. So the idea here is as follows. The query, the questions also have to be transformed into embeddings so that they are able to be understood and be searched for. Because if the information now is in the vector representation format, makes sense that the answer, or rather the question, the query, has to be the same format. That way, the algorithm is able to do the searching in the vector store and so forth and get the right information. And of course, that gives us the result. So essentially, this is how it looks like again. Okay. So we have the vector store loading. So this is not necessarily just what happens with OpenAI. In this case, we're talking about it, but I'm talking about in general, this is what would happen. So in this case here, we have the document loading. So what happens then, we split everything, and then all the splittings, those are the vector representation of our documents here. They put into a storage, a vector store. Okay. Now the retrieval, in this case, everything is going to be indexed, right? So now we have a question or a query. We go through the vector store, the retriever. So we retrieve the relevant splits because the information now is in this different format. And now the search happens to find what goes with what makes more sense, right? To find the most similar pieces of data so that we understand what's going on. And then once that is retrieved, the most similar pieces of data, that's what it's then put into a prompt, right? So we have that prompt, the query, and we have that what we've received from the retrieval. The documents were split and everything. And with the prompt and with the help of the large language model, in this case just a model, that's when we get the answer. So this, my friends, this is how it works in the back end. Now, if we go ahead and look back at the OpenAI, you notice that in this case, OpenAI simplifies everything for us when it comes to this whole process, because now we have some sort of like a black box where all of the things that I've just told you now is happening. All we have to be concerned about is to get the document, push them into this black box per se, and then we can just start conversing with our large language model, in this case, our model, in this case, in the form of our Assistants API. So this is what we're going to be doing next. Next, we're going to learn how to do knowledge retrieval by pushing or by uploading files, in this case documents, to our Assistants API, and then be able to ask questions about those documents. So I went ahead and created a new project called Study Buddy, and I've set up the environment variables and everything. And I also have requirements .txt. We have all of these. Let's see, we don't need request anymore, I don't think. That's okay. So let's go ahead and run pipe install real quick here. Our request, so we can get all those dependencies. All right, so we got all those dependencies. That's very good. And what we'll do next, let's get rid of that. In our app here, everything should be looking good. Nothing new. I've got a few imports as well. Some of them we're not going to use them. That's okay. We can get rid of them when we need to. And one thing I noticed I've changed here is that now for a model, we have GPT-4 1106 preview. Now remember, these could change depending on when you're watching this. You can go to the documentations and see that. Okay, but this should work. So the first step we need to do is how do we upload files to the Assistants API in the backend? Okay, so let's put number 1 here. Upload a file to OpenAI Embeddings. Essentially, that's what we're doing. Embeddings, yes. Okay, so to do so, first of all, we need to get those files. And I already have that prepared for us. So I'm going to go ahead and get it. The one file, at least, which is going to be, in this case, this is the understanding cryptocurrency. It's very short, nothing too large. That's okay. And we're going to use that and upload that to the embeddings, the OpenAI embeddings. Okay. So I'm going to say file path. I'm going to create a file path here. And because it's literally here, so what we're going to do is just going to go ahead and say ./, and of course, make sure that depending on what operating system you're on. So this is how we do on Mac. So I know it's cryptocurrency, so I'm going to cryptocurrency.pdf. That's the name. So make sure the name is exactly the same. And then I'm going to create an actual file object, and I'm going to say client, right? Beta. And I'm going to files. Let's see. No, it has to go client files. It's not beta, which is good. So, and then let's say I'm going to create, and I'm going to pass the file. I'm just going to say open, and then pass the file path as such. And I'm going to say RB. And we need to also pass the purpose why we are uploading this. In this case, I'm just going to say that purpose is going to be equal to assistants, like that. Okay, there we go. So now we have, let me put this perhaps in a new line. No, doesn't work. So now we've created the actual file object, which is going to be pushed into the OpenAI embeddings, in this case, the OpenAI Assistants API. Okay, and then step number 2, very simple, is we're going to create an assistant. Oh, we've done this many times, so you should know how to do this now. So I'm going to just go ahead and do it anyway. So assistant, I'm going to use our client. I'm going to have to do beta for now. Assistants.create, and we have to pass a few things. First of all, it's going to be name. I'm going to call this study buddy. And then instructions. And I have the instructions here, so I'm not going to bore you. So I'm going to just get all of that and show you here. Okay, so I do have the instructions here. You are a helpful study assistant who knows a lot about understanding research papers. Your role is to summarize papers and do all these things. So you're going to have access to all of this, so there's no need for me to go through. But it's important to remember that whenever you're creating these instructions, these are the prompts, so you need to be very thoughtful and very specific of what you want these assistants to be able to do. Next, the important thing here is tools. The tools we're going to have to pass here are essentially simple. I'm going to pass just one tool. And the type of this tool, I'm going to say is going to be retrieval, because we want to be able to upload a file or files. Okay, I'm going to say model. In this case, I'm going to say model, pass the model that we created at the top. And then we need to pass also file IDs. Notice it says IDs, not ID. That means we can pass more than one file, and that's why we have a list here. So I'm just going to go ahead and say the file object.id like this. Okay, this file object, again, remember, that's what we created here. And for reasons that you know by now, I'm just going to go ahead and get the assist ID, so we can use it later. So I'm going to say assist ID. I'm going to use the assistant and get the ID. I'm going to go ahead and print that one, assist ID. And then I'm going to just paste some of the code here. This is for later, once we've run once. So we have the thread ID and assist ID, then we're going to add them here. So these are old ones, so they're not going to work. So for now, we're just going to go ahead and make them empty as such. So, and I can also go ahead and go like this for now. And next, I'm going to go ahead and create, in step 3, we create a thread. Again, nothing new here, same thing. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to create a message here. And for now, I'm just going to say, what is mining? Something like that. That's okay. So let me go ahead and create a thread here. So thread, just client, beta, threads, and we'll just go ahead and create a thread. No need to pass anything. And let's go ahead and get the thread ID right away. That ID. Let's go ahead and print thread ID like that. Say run the assistant. So I'm going to say run client threads runs create. Okay, and we need to pass the thread ID, so it's going to be thread ID as such, and assist ID, gonna be assist ID. And instructions, I can just put something here that says, please address the user as Bond, as Bruce. I'm also going to go ahead and pull in this wait for run completion. We've seen this before, so no need for me to go through. The idea is that it's going to go ahead and wait for a few moments, make sure that everything is running, and then it's going to give me the time, formatted elapsed time, to say how long it took to run and everything. Okay, so we've seen this before. That's what we're going to be using, of course, to run, right, through our, to run it. So now we're going to go ahead and say run it. How do we do that? I'm going to say wait completion, and then I'm going to pass the client, which is going to be our client, and let's pass the thread ID. It's going to be thread ID, and let's pass the run ID, which is going to be run.id as such. Okay, because we have the run here. Okay. And of course, if you want, we can check the run steps logs, and this, we've seen that before. So there we go. So very simple. Let's go ahead and run this. Most importantly, we'll know hopefully that we're going to be able to push this cryptocurrency PDF file into OpenAI embeddings, right? So it's going to go into all the things that I've showed you before, what happens in the back end. And we should have an assistant. Let's go ahead and run this real quick. If all goes well, we should be able to go. So I'm going to say Python 3. That's that, and run. So we get some things here, but let's go ahead first and get the assistant ID. So we copy that and add it here. Let's get the thread ID and put it here. Okay, so that next time we can run things differently. So let's go to OpenAI here, the assistants in the back end. Let's see if this actually worked. If I go ahead and refresh here, we should see indeed that we have Study Buddy. This is our new assistant. There is the ID and everything is good. If I click, of course, we have all that information and the model that it's using. And most importantly, we see that the retrieval is ticked, as well as the cryptocurrency PDF file was uploaded. This is real great. We knew this would happen, of course, but it's always nice to see. And most importantly, it says assistance response, the document Understanding Cryptocurrency by the University of Kentucky, blah, blah, blah. So it goes through all the things really and does a summary of the everything, okay, which is good. And also we have the run steps and voila. So nothing new what we're seeing, but most importantly, we know that things are working because we got the document uploaded and it's part of the knowledge base now. Okay, let's go close this. And now that we have the IDs, right, so we don't have to go back and recreate the same assistant, we're going to hard code them here. This is just for testing purposes. And now we no longer need to create this. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out, as well as comment this out. And what else? I'm going to comment this out also, because we don't need that. So now, before we run, I can then create the actual message. So I'm going to say message is equal client beta threads messages, and I'm going to create a message, which means I need to pass the thread ID, right? And the role is going to be user, and content, this is where we pass our message, which is the query per se. What is mining? Okay, so now you should get an answer of what is mining because we have added or pushed into the embeddings, right? The file, in this case, the PDF file about cryptocurrency. So it should know how to answer to that. Let me go ahead and save this, make sure everything is good. Okay, so everything seems to be great. Let's go ahead and run again. So that means now we should be able to see the answer pertaining to what is mining. So it's going to go and look at the document that we uploaded and answer according to that document. So assistant response, mining is a process through which cryptocurrencies can be obtained. It involves the creation of blocks and blah, 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 and everything it tells us that this was actually able to get the information from that PDF file, which is wonderful. So this is working. So there we go. It's very simple. If you go back to the code here, you can see we still have one, hopefully just one, because we didn't repeat things, right? We have study body and everything is there. And if I click, I should have still the file, and I can upload as many files as I want, of course. We'll get there, but the basics is here. So you're able to see how to get, in this case, retrieval, the knowledge retrieval, how to get this to work by uploading a file, a PDF file, to enhance the knowledge base for our Assistants API. All right, there you have it. Now that we know how to upload files and converse, per se, ask questions about that file, in this case, the PDF file that we uploaded, in conjunction with our Assistants API, it is time for us to do something a little bit cooler, which is to build our study buddy. So the idea is we're going to upload the file, the one that we uploaded now, and maybe another file, and then start chatting and asking questions about those files or those PDF files, documents. Let's go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to create yet another file to differentiate a few things. So I'm going to say main.py or py. And the differentiation is going to be a little, I would say, minimal. So let me get all of this code from the app file and pass it over. So we have everything here. Let's see. And actually, we need to get the IDs because we need them. I'm going to copy that and put them here. And in this case, we no longer need that. So let's just get rid of that altogether. All right, now because the nature of this application, this is going to be a Streamlit application, there are a few things that we need to do to set everything up. So the first thing I'm going to put here is the nature of Streamlit is that we need to make sure that we have sessions. Anytime you hit enter or click a button in a Streamlit application, what happens is that it's going to go ahead and reload the entire application, the entire view or the entire window, which is not what we want. So I'm not going to go into this whole session thing with Streamlit. Just this is going to help us, especially when we want to create this chatbot using Streamlit. And the great thing also about Streamlit is that all of that is included. So there is actually a chat form that we can create quickly with Streamlit. That's why Streamlit is pretty cool. Okay, so first I'm going to go ahead and initialize all these sessions that we need. Okay, so I'm going to start by putting an if statement here. If file underscore ID list. So this is going to hold all of the file IDs because potentially we can upload more than one file, and not in st.session state. If that's the case, then we're going to create that session state.file IDs list, and that's going to be just an empty list. Okay, we just have to do this. And I'm going to do another one as well. So if start chat, which is going to be part of a button, really, not in st.session state, st.session that start chat, I'm going to just say is going to be false. What else? Now I'm going to use the thread, if thread ID not in session state, and then we're going to say st session state dot thread. Okay, very good. Those are the sessions we need to set up. Okay, we're going to go straight and start setting up the front end, in this case the page. So I'm going to go ahead and just say set up our front end page. And to do so with Streamlit is extremely simple. I'm going to say st and then set, there's a function called set page config. And here we can pass a few things. So I'm going to say page title, say study buddy, say chat and learn. That sounds very good. And page icon, we can actually pass an icon here like this, books. Okay, so you just put This is the icon representation of a stack of books. This is where we're going to start our function definitions, etc. So essentially, this is where the fun will start. So the first thing we need to do is to figure out a way to upload a file to OpenAI, which we know how to do that. So I'm going to go and define the upload AI. So we need a file path. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and do that. We've seen that before with open. And I'm going to find file, pass the file path, and then say RB. And I'm going to say as file, and I'm going to say response. In this case, I'm going to go get the client, files, create, and then pass the file, which is going to be just the file that we have here, we got here, right? And then I'm going to get the path, or read actually, because it's going to come in this case, I want it to come in as bytes. Okay, stream, really. All right. And then, of course, I'm going to pass the purpose. It's going to be assistants. And what I want to happen for this function is I want to return the actual ID. So I'm going to say response.id. So this will return the ID of the file that was uploaded. Very simple. And next, what we'll do here, we're going to create a sidebar. Okay, the sidebar. So where users can upload files. So here I'm going to say file upload. I'm going to put that in a function. So I'm going to put that in a variable because we want access to that. So file upload, and to generate a sidebar in Streamlit, again, very, very simple. So we just say st, that's sidebar as such. And I'm going to say dot file uploader because we want actually a sidebar with a file uploader. And we can pass some text to say upload a file to be transformed into embeddings. In a real application, obviously, you probably don't want to talk about embeddings because most users won't even care. But it's okay, we're here. And then I need to pass here a key just to say something file upload. And that's that. Now we're going to also add a button that says when click, then they can actually upload the file. Okay, so this is going to be just the interface where they can upload a file, right? Drop the file, and then we need to allow them to click to say actually want to upload the file that we just dropped here. Upload file button, and we can also store the file ID. So I'm going to say if st, that's sidebar as such. I'm going to create a button, and this is going to be upload file. And this will make sense once you start seeing things, but I hope you're seeing the pieces coming together. I'm going to say if, in this case, file uploaded, this should be file uploaded. Okay. If there's something there, if file, let's see, uploaded, there we go. We got to go ahead and open file uploaded in this case and get the name, and this should probably be f string, and we need to pass that we want to say here we want to write this as a binary. That's why we're going to say wb write as binary, rb is read as binary, as we saw earlier here. Okay, and all of that as f, and I'm going to say f that write. I'm going to write that file uploaded. Okay, and I'm going to say get buffer. And in this case here, there are times when also we want to allow users to upload more than one files. So I'm going to just say something like maybe another file ID, and I'm going to say uploaded. Let's say upload. I'm going to call the upload to OpenAI, and then put an f string here. And this, I'm going to pass the file uploaded and get the name as such. And let's make sure that we take care of the session. So the session state file ID list. Let's say file underscore ID that list doesn't give me IntelliSense. That's okay. And I'm going to append, let's see, file ID list. Make sure I have that file ID lists, file IDs. So let's be file ID. Okay, there we go. And we're going to append our another file ID as such. And SD, I'm going to create that sidebar and write something to it, which is going to be file ID. And then I'm going to pass another file ID as such. So essentially we're just writing on the wall, on the sidebar, the ID of the other file ID that was added. So each time we added a file, and then we can see all those IDs. Okay, so what I want to do next is I want to display those file IDs. So I'm going to make sure, again, look at session, state, file ID list. If that's all good, then I'm going to go to sidebar and write, in this case, uploaded file IDs. So this is where we're actually showing the things, really. And then the bottom, we say for file ID in SD.session file, make sure I get the right list. Okay, because it's going to be a list with all those file IDs that have potentially been uploaded. And I'm going to write into the sidebar again, and I'm going to pass the file ID. Now, once we have these file IDs, we need to associate them to the current assistant. That's very important because each assistant can have multiple files. Okay, so how do we associate them? So I'm going to write here, associate each file ID with the current assistant. Okay, so I'm going to say assistant file, really, and say client, beta, and assistants dot files, and I'm going to go ahead and create. To create a file, as you know by now, we need to pass the assistant ID, which we can get by say assist ID, right? Oops. Assist ID, and then we need the file ID, which is going to be file ID that we have there. Okay, so that's how we associate that each file that we add is going to be associated to the correct assistant. Okay. Next, we are going to go ahead and say button to initiate the chat session. Okay, we're getting there, okay? So I'm going to put in if statement. So you'll notice that in Streamlit, to start, in this case, to initiate something, a handler, right? A button click handler of some sort, you say SD, put an if SD, that's sidebar, that button, and I can say start chatting, and this is where we handle the click. Okay, so first we need to make sure that all the files have been uploaded. That's very important. So that we can check that by saying SD, go to session state, and then file ID list. Okay, make sure that we have that session, which means we have something, and then we're going to make sure that our session state for start chat, in this case, is going to be true, because that means we have everything set up for things to get going, because we've just clicked. So that means we have the file ID session, which means we have IDs. That means then the session for the start chat has to be true at this point. Okay, so now we're going to create a new thread. We could create a new thread, or we can just go ahead and use that same thread. That's okay. We're just going to go ahead and create a new thread for this chat session. Okay, so again, nothing new. You know how to create a thread, so I'm going to call this chat thread, and so I'm going to say client, or yes, client, go beta, threads, and create a thread. Okay, now we have that thread. Set the session again of that thread. This is very important. A lot of sessions here. for the reason I said. So that's just how Streamlit works. And session state, and I'm going to use the thread ID, and I'm going to pass our chat thread that ID. So now we have set the session for this whole thing, the thread ID session, to the thread ID of this newly created thread. Okay, I'm going to write something to the wall. All right, so I'm going to say thread ID, and I'm going to pass the chat.id, chat thread.id. Notice that we're inside of this if statement here that handles the on click, and then else, if none of that is true, I'm going to go ahead and just say something st.sidebar.warning, right? We can just invoke a warning, so the text is going to be red-ish, and I can just say something, no files found, please upload at least one file to get started. All right, very good. So we're making real good progress here. So one thing I want you to keep in mind is that as we pass these documents to the embeddings, the OpenAI embeddings, so we are able to attach all that information to enhance, as I call it, the model, so we can converse or chat with it. Whatever comes, when we ask a question, whatever comes, the result, the response, it also has other metadata such as citations. Okay, to say, okay, this information that I got it from this place in the document. Now we have a very simple document, but you can imagine if you have a very large document, then this could be very helpful. And so what I'm going to do here, just in the interest of time, I'm going to paste in a helper function that will essentially process message with citations. Okay, so it's very simple. As you see here, extract content and annotation from the message and format citations as footnotes. So it goes through, gets the content that we get as a response, right? And then goes through and looks for certain annotation, looks for certain attributes in the message, the whole payload, where we see annotations. And if it sees annotations, of course, it creates those annotations, goes through, creates the annotations, and so forth. So now there are some limitations because we said that we can pass different files, right, which we will see. But in this case here, for retrieving decided files, we're going to do things, we're going to use some dummy way or dummy data to get that going. And I'm hard coding here just for testing purposes. I hope by the time at some point, once this Assistants API is mature, we have ways to do certain things such as calling the cited files details instead of us having to do all of this. Okay, so but this is just to give you some ideas. Now again, this is not perfect code, it just works for what we're trying to do here, to give you some ideas. Okay, so in this case here, for the file name cited file, we are putting in this case the cryptocurrency PDF, right? Hard coded it, again, not a good idea, but that's what we're doing anyway. Okay, so that's what we're doing, and then we have the citations list here, and as all of that is happening, we're retrieving all those annotations, and we're appending all of them so that everything is set up. Okay, so that's what we do, and after that we create a footnote in form of a full response, and we get that information, we put it all together, and then we'll return that. So that is essentially what we're doing in this process message with citations. Let's go ahead and continue putting together the front end, the API, okay? Or I should say the page itself. So I'm going to say so here is where I'm going to put the main interface so we can actually see things. Okay. So I'm going to use Streamlit again, and I'm going to add a title for our page. Call it study body. Now notice the difference here. I'm adding the title before we're adding the title to the page configuration, which is, those are two different things. And if you want to learn more about Streamlit, which I encourage you to do, you can just Google real quick or Streamlit and then go to documentations. It is the most simplest, straightforward way to create prototype applications. Okay, so it's very good in Python. And I'm going to also Streamlit here. I'm going to write something here. It's kind of like a subheader. And I can say, learn fast by chatting with your documents. Okay, good for marketing, I guess. Okay, next we are going to, again, check a few things, check sessions to make sure everything is good so we can proceed. So first we're going to check that the chat is not already in session. So to do so, we're going to say if st, go to sessions, that chat, start chat. And if there is that session, so if there is a chat session, that means things have started. So now I'm going to go initialize them. And now we're going to go ahead and initialize our model. So I'm going to say if OpenAI model, not in session. Okay, I'm going to say st that session state that OpenAI model. I'm going to just say this is going to be the ChatGPT or GPT 4, like that. So we're using the preview. Okay, and that's the only thing that actually works with what we're trying to do. If you try to do GPT 3 Turbo, 3.5 Turbo, it's not going to work. And also I'm going to check messages not in st session state. And then I'm going to say session state messages, set that to empty. So this is going to help us, of course, with the bot, with the chat bot. All right, so then go ahead and show existing messages, if any. So for messages in st that session, that messages, and I'm going to now invoke the chat. Notice that this chat, this is what we're talking about. Notice, as I said, we don't have to do anything really when it comes to creating a chat box per se. Streamlit has that. So I can say dot chat. Right, it's part of the framework, so I can go ahead and say chat message. All right, look at that, and I'm going to pass the message, or message in this case, and get the role. This has to change to message. Okay, singular, and then we're going to go ahead and add that. And then we're going to write the content inside of a markdown. Okay, so I'm going to say message and get content of that message. Okay, so now we're putting together the actual chat, and this will make a lot of sense once we start running this. And I apologize, there's a lot of code, but believe me, this is going to work. Well, we hope. Okay, so now we're going to chat the user. So now we are going to go ahead. All right. Now we're going to go ahead and say chat input for the user. So this is where they're going to add something to as a prompt. So I say if prompt, in this case, st.chat prompt. Look at that. We have chat input as they call it. That's the beauty of Streamlit. I'm going to say what's new. That's going to be the first thing they will see. So what's new? All right, which will allow them to then add a user. So next I'm going to go ahead and add user message to the state and display on the screen. So I'm going to put session messages, and I'm going to append. In this case, I'm going to pass in as a dictionary. So first of all, do role and user. Okay, it's going to be user for role, and then for the content, that's where we're going to pass the actual prompt. We're going to say chat messages or message, and this is, we're going to show that this is the part where the user, so we have the user, so this is the user chat message, and we're going to write that using a markdown, and we're going to pass that prompt. So now we're going to go ahead and add the user's message to the existing thread. How do we do that? Well, we're going to use client, go beta, and go to threads and messages and create that message. And how do we get, or what is this, what do we need to create a message? We need a thread ID. So we're going to go through our session again, because that's what's driving everything. And go get a thread ID. And we need the role, in this case going to be user, and the content is going to be our message. Oh, actually it's going to be our prompt, right, to create that message. Very good. Okay, we're getting there. Next we're going to create and run. Create a run with additional instructions. Okay, so when I say run, again, nothing new here. Beta, threads, runs, and create. I need to pass the thread ID. So I'm going to go through the session state again. Get a thread ID. And then assistant ID. We pass the assist ID. And then we're going to pass instructions. I have the instructions. For the instructions. And then let's pass the instructions which I have here. So please answer the questions using the knowledge provided in the files. When adding additional information, make sure to distinguish it with bold or underlined text. Most likely they won't do that, but it's okay, just to make sure we can distinguish things. So next, what I want to do is I want to be able to show a spinner as all of this process is happening before we get to the actual response. So that's good user interface addition. So show a spinner while the assistant is thinking. Okay, so I'm going to say with spinner. So I say spinner, and it's going to say wait, generating response, such. And then inside here, I'm going to put a while loop. So I'm going to look at the run, right? So status. We've done this differently before, but that's okay. But we can just go straight here. Status. If it's not completed, then we're going to sleep for 1 second and then run. Okay, so we can say run, client, beta, threads, runs, and retrieve. So we're going to retrieve, in this case, our run. So we're going to pass the thread ID, which we know we need to get from the session state, and get the thread ID, and then pass the run ID, which we can get that from just run.id. Okay, and outside the while, we are going to then retrieve messages added by the assistant. Okay, I'm going to say message, or messages in this case. I'm going to say client, go to threads, because that's where all messages are, and messages, and go to list. And of course we need to pass the thread ID, go again to session, as such. So now we have all the messages, and we can process all of that. going to process and display assist messages. Okay, so I'm going to put everything inside of a list to make things a little bit easier. So I'm going to say assistant messages for run. Okay, and I'm going to pass the message. Okay, that's very important. And I'm going to pass a for, and then we're going to actually pass a for loop inside here, which is pretty cool, for messages, or actually for, say, message in. Okay, say message. So we pass a message first, and then on another index here, we're going to go do a for loop. So it's for message. So what we do here, we have a message, and then for message in messages. So we're gonna make sure that if message that run ID is equal to run that ID, and the message that role is also equal to assistant. So essentially, we're just making sure to put all of the messages from our assistant into this array, so that way we can then loop through them. So in this case here, I can say, and once we have this array list, I can say for message, I know a lot of message here, and then go to our assistant messages for run, because it is indeed a list, so we can loop through it. In this case here, I'm going to just say full response, and I'm going to say process message with citation. This is where we're using that function, that helper function we created earlier, or just added there. And I'm going to pass message. It's going to be equal to messages. Actually, it's going to be equal to message, because we're inside of a loop, so whatever we're getting there. And when that happens, we are going to also set the session state messages and append all those messages in. So in this case, I'm going to create a dictionary here. So for the role, it's going to be assistant. And again, for content, we're going to pass the full response. So create a dictionary to add into our messages state. Okay, and then here I'm going to go ahead and get the chat message, because we need now to use that, which is going to be the assistant. And then we're going to add all of those responses onto the screen. So I'm going to use markdown again and pass the full response, and I'm going to also pass the unsafe allow to true. Okay, unsafe allow to true for HTML. So if you have over, let's go markdown here, you can scroll down and see that the unsafe allow boolean, by default, any HTML tags found in the body will be escaped and therefore treated as pure text. This behavior may be turned off by setting this argument to true. All right. Okay, so it's hard to show you everything, but we are inside of if, in this case, to make sure that we chat input for the user. So I'm going to come down here, go to that level. I'm going to say else. If none of this is actually happening, that means we can prompt users to start chat. So we just say st and say write. You can just write something and say, please upload at least a file to get started by clicking on the button. Say on the start chat button as such. All right, there's a lot of things here, but that's okay. It should be all good. Okay, again, remember, you will have access to this code, so it's not a big deal. So essentially, we are creating this chat, and there's a lot of sessions going on here, but that's important, like I said, because with Streamlit, you have to make sure that these sections are all set up, because Streamlit, whenever you click a button, it refreshes the entire page, and that means you start from scratch, so you lose all the state. So we want to make sure that we have the state. That's why we have all this state thing going on here. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out their documentations. Okay, so we should have everything set up for us. Let's see if this works. Let me go ahead and make sure that we can say Streamlit, run, and make sure we're running the main, not the app.py or py. Hit enter. And you can see we have this very nice user interface that was created, which we can go ahead and use. So for now, let's see if this works. I'm going to go to browse, and then I'm going to go ahead and get the cryptocurrency again. And there we go. We have this cryptocurrency. It's there. Now we're going to go ahead and say upload. It's uploading, and voila. So that file was indeed uploaded. File ID, uploaded file ID is there. Very good. So is it true? If we go to OpenAI and let's go to refresh, and we can actually look at the files, we should hopefully see cryptocurrency. One of these files I added a little bit ago is going to show us exactly the purpose, status is ready, and how the size of it, and of course also the file ID. Okay, we have two there, but that's okay. Now let's go back to the application and let's start chatting. So click start chat, and what's up? I'm going to say, tell me about data mining. Let's go ahead and see what's going to happen. So voila, you can see the weight generating response is working. And then we have this, all this was given to us by Streamlit. That's really cool. If we had to build all of that ourselves, that would be pretty, would take us a long time. Okay, so now it's going to look at the cryptocurrency and look at it and make sure that it gets the information that it needs. It appears that there may be some confusion around the term data mining. It pertains to cryptocurrency, which the uploaded files seem to discuss. This is good because it's saying the uploaded files seems to discuss. So it's looking at those two files that one I uploaded before, and that's okay. Usually you should probably just get one there. But also it's probably from the previous upload that we did when we first ran this. It's okay. So in this case, data mining in the context of cryptocurrencies usually refers to the process of mining cryptocurrencies themselves, and blah, blah, blah. And there we go. So we can say, can you tell me how many cryptocurrencies are being discussed in the document? Hit enter, and voila, there we go. Okay, there we go. I apologize the inconvenience, but it seems there is an issue accepting the content document titled Crypto PDF. The page has had no contents when I tried to open it, which means I cannot determine how many crypto. Okay. All right, that's okay. What I can do, again, remember this is still in beta, sometimes happens. So what I can do, let me see if I can delete one of these. Perhaps maybe that's gonna, that shouldn't be a thing anyway. But sometimes this happens and sometimes it does weird stuff. So it's okay. We're just gonna try again. Maybe this time it will work. Okay, so now it worked. Say, based on the search results, document mentions several cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, Litecoin, I think that's what it's called, Ether, and potential others are not named explicitly, and blah, blah, blah. That's really good. I can also ask. Now, the other thing also, I can go ahead and upload a different file or another file. Okay, so I'm going to say upload. Oh, shoot. So this is a problem. Now that I uploaded two files. So if I refresh this is exactly what I didn't want to do. I should have this file, just delete a few here. And it's very strange because it shows all of these different files that have been uploaded. Let me just delete some of them. Some of them says upload, others says uploaded. I'm not sure why, but okay. Let's go ahead and delete some of them and go back go back here and I'm going to browse to go get yet another one. So I have another one called lipids. This is a biology file, and that's the one I'm going to go ahead and upload. Try again. This sometimes doesn't work. Let me upload that one. Okay, that file was uploaded, and let's see if I can upload another one. It's an issue because we have that. Let's upload this one. Okay, so now we have two files that were uploaded. Let's go back to OpenAI, and I'm going to refresh here. Okay, so we have a few files that were uploaded, but one thing I can do, I can go to Assistant. So I think this will be better, and go here, and I can see the files that were uploaded. Wow, there's a lot of files that were uploaded. So it looks like when you first upload something, they change their names from upload first, and then the IDs are created. I think that's what's happening. I'm not sure. It's very strange. So it's a little bit buggy, but it's okay. So let's see if this works. So now we're going to go ahead and start chatting. Okay, let's talk about, because we have two files, let me go ahead and talk about biology. I'm going to say, what is a lipid? Okay, so now it should be able to go and fetch the file, in this case, the lipid, the biology file that has information about lipids and so forth, hopefully. All right, this worked. So lipids are biological molecules that have limited solubility in water and are soluble in non-polar organic solvents. Okay, so this is really good because it went and got the information from the document, because we have even the source and everything here that is showing. Very good. So I can also go back and ask about, in this case, cryptocurrency. What is crypto? Okay, so it comes here with 4 resources, crypto such as Bitcoin, Litecoin, and all this stuff, and explains everything. And very awesome. Okay, so this is actually working, which is very exciting. Now remember, these are just examples that I assembled really to showcase how to use Assistants API, and so that you can take this to the next level. Okay, so this is no production code, obviously, for many reasons, but at least it gives you some ideas. The other thing also to remember is that the Assistants API is still in beta, which means they're still working on it, and maybe some APIs will change by the time you're watching this, but I hope you understand at least what's happening, the basics of how Assistants API work. I give you a little bit the rundown of the vector store embedding, so how things work in the background, and how Assistants API in so many ways allow us developers to really not think too much about what's in the background, which is really exciting. But also I need to let you know that with that we get a lot of some disadvantages, meaning that we don't have a lot of control, but with all of that flexibility, all of that abstraction, we also lose a few things. One of the things you will notice, even though Assistants API it's most likely going to keep getting better, it's important to also know that there are other tools that you can use that perhaps give you a little bit more flexibility, but also that means that you have to do a little bit more work per se, not too much. There's this tool called LangChain, which I'm just going to let you know about. It's a wonderful framework that allows you to really assemble many other models, in this case many other large language models, because there's not just OpenAI, ChatGPTs and GPTs, there are many others as well. For this framework, you are able to actually see most of the things we talked about, most of the things that OpenAI have abstracted things out for us, which is a good thing. But you're able to see or be able to do more in the backend in terms of choosing your own vector stores, indexing all your documents. So the process that I showed you in the backend that's happening, you will actually be able to see more. It becomes more apparent, if I may say that. All right, so that is a different topic, but just something to keep in mind. And I hope this course has given you something at least to think about, some good starting points when it comes to the Assistant API. And you can keep learning, of course, watching for the documentation, because things will change. That's just a known fact. And so, but I hope this course was able to give you the tools that you need to at least start thinking about how to use the Assistants API to build all sort of things. And now we didn't touch on using the code interpreter as a tool directly, really, but that's something you can do as an exercise. So you can create a bot, or you can create a tool that will analyze code. In fact, I think we talked a little bit as an exercise earlier, but now you have the tools. You know Streamlit, or at least you have some ideas. You can use that to create a code buddy, something like this, right? Or a pair programming buddy or something like that, that will help you debug things and go from there, right? So a lot of things that you can do here, a lot of things, but I've just scratched the surface, and I hope you enjoy this course. I hope you like this style that I use to teach this course, and I hope this was useful. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you next.